You're in the wrong seat. Right. The sound of paper tearing cracked through the first-class cabin like a gunshot. Heads turned. Conversations froze. Coffee paused mid-sip. Samantha Yates, 52, pressed the shredded boarding pass into the 13-year-old's chest like a final verdict. "This row is for contributing guests only," she said coldly. "You'll be more comfortable in the back." The boy didn't speak. He just stared at the torn ticket in his hand, his breath shallow. "Tell us where you're watching from, because in the next 5 minutes, $940 million will freeze, and 19 airports will shut their gates." Julian DuPont didn't look like he belonged in 3A. He wore a plain gray hoodie, slim-fit jeans, and black sneakers with scuffed soles. No blazer, no monogrammed carry-on, just a navy blue backpack and an old tablet tucked into its side pocket. To Samantha, he was another kid who wandered into the wrong section. But to everyone else watching, he was just still. Too still. The businessman in 3C shifted. "Miss, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The kid—" "There's no mistake," Samantha cut in, voice sharp. "Protocol requires relocation when seating has been overassigned. His new assignment is 31B. "But that seat—" The man tried again. "It's not up for discussion," she said. "Move along." Julian said nothing, but in his right hand, his fingers had already brushed the edge of his phone. The screen inside was still warm. So was the access. 10 hours earlier, back home in Baton Rouge, Julian had sat across the breakfast table from his grandmother, Henrietta DuPont. The morning sun lit the edge of her silver hair like a crown. Between them sat 2 cups of mint tea, a linen napkin, and a small white card, the size of a driver's license. Henrietta had pushed it across the table without a word. Julian turned it over. Air Ethica Gateway. Emergency delegate access. Level, black flag, time limited, 48 hours. Authority, cross-border. Scope, ethics override. Regulatory violation, passenger displacement protocol. He looked up. This is real?" Henrietta's gaze was steady. "It's not a gift. It's a burden. If something happens, don't react. Record, confirm, then act. But what if they—" "Don't let them pull you out of your seat," she said softly. "And if they do, make it count." Julian now stood silently in the aisle of Flight 227, torn ticket in one hand, backpack slung over one shoulder. Samantha walked him past 16 rows of onlookers who said nothing. They watched. They whispered. A few lifted their phones. No one stopped it. In economy, he was wedged between a coughing man and an aisle blocked with bags. He didn't even sit right away. Instead, he opened his phone. The Air Ethica Gateway interface greeted him. Delegate access, 41H02 mem remaining, a blinking field appeared. "Do you wish to initiate ethics pre-flag? Requires audio-visual confirmation." He tapped yes. A live window opened, syncing to an auto-tagged video already circulating on the internal system, uploaded by a businesswoman in row 2 who had seen the entire thing. It captured Samantha's tone, her words, the tear. Julian reviewed the metadata. Timestamp, verified. Source, encrypted. Witnesses, 14. He hit submit. Then a new prompt. Activate black flag clause. Warning. This will trigger system-wide ethics escalation, suspend contracts, and notify all regulatory bodies. His hand hovered, and he remembered his grandmother's voice. "You don't need volume. You need precision." Julian tapped confirm. Within 27 seconds, the cabin crew's tablets began to vibrate. In gate control at New Orleans Louis Armstrong Airport, the operations screen turned amber, then red. Air Ethica Gateway flagged Flight 227 for discriminatory displacement. Automatically, the airline's ethics score dropped to critical. Within 90 seconds, 19 airports, from Houston to Halifax, froze all active contracts with the carrier. totaling $940 million in service rights. Refueling privileges paused. Maintenance hangars locked. Gate assignments revoked. 5 affiliated airlines were delisted from ESG investment eligibility pending emergency review. Back in the cockpit, the captain read the notice and muttered, "Jesus Christ, who's the kid?" Samantha felt it before she saw it. A cold sweat prickled the back of her neck. Her colleague Mason stepped forward from the galley, tablet in hand. "Sam, they're grounding us." "What?" "We've been flagged. Tier 1. FAA and Transport Canada are on alert." Samantha turned toward the back of the plane, her eyes landing on Julien. He wasn't glaring. He wasn't smug. He was just sitting there, calm, steady. And she finally understood. She hadn't moved a child. She'd just activated the wrong bloodline. The captain's voice broke over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been advised of a delay due to an unexpected ethics review. Please remain in your seats. Do not exit the aircraft." Whispers, murmurs, phones lit up. Someone 2 rows ahead pulled up live flight watch. Within seconds, the screen showed, "Ethics, freeze. Flight 227. Discriminatory flag active. Subject, minor passenger displacement." The man turned to his colleague. "Holy hell, he wasn't kidding." An hour later, passengers were escorted off the plane one by one. Samantha was not among them. She had been pulled aside by airport officials. In a small terminal office, a screen replayed the moment she tore the ticket. Her voice, cold. Her hand, dismissive. Her assumption, fatal. She didn't speak. The evidence did. Julien was the last to leave. As he stepped onto the tile floor of the terminal, reporters were already gathering beyond the glass. A few had caught wind of the freeze. The hashtag #BlackFlagClause had begun trending. At the far end of the terminal stood Henrietta DuPont, her cane balanced against one hand, a tablet glowing in the other. She met her grandson's eyes and nodded once. "You escalated cleanly," she said. Julien looked down. "There was proof." "Then the system did its job," she replied. "And now, so must we." The terminal was quiet, unnaturally so. Julien DuPont sat in the private waiting area just beyond Gate B12, watching the sun rise over the Louisiana tarmac. The sky was bruised orange, glowing behind rows of grounded jets. Outside the glass, movement had all but stopped. Airport workers lingered near fuel trucks that couldn't move. Boarding bridges stood frozen mid-rotation. The effect was eerie, like someone had pressed pause on an entire industry. Julien didn't feel triumphant. He felt alert, like something had begun, but hadn't yet finished. Next to him, Henrietta DuPont flipped through a digital file on her tablet, her thin-framed glasses perched at the edge of her nose. "They've triggered cross-border arbitration," she said without looking up. "Transport Canada has frozen service privileges on their end too. It's a joint freeze now." Julien nodded slightly. "They're scared," she added. And they should be. Halfway across the terminal, Samantha Yates sat in a glass-walled meeting room, flanked by 2 airline executives and a federal ethics liaison. A muted screen played the video again and again. Her voice, "You don't belong here." The tear. Julien's silence. One of the executives, the VP of Regulatory Compliance, sighed and buried his face in his hands. "This just hit Bloomberg," he muttered. "We're losing ESG backing fast. 3 pension funds already pulled out." The FAA investigator tapped her stylus against the table. "Did you know who the passenger was when you asked him to move?" "I didn't ask," Samantha said quietly. "Exactly," the woman replied. "You saw a hoodie, not a human." By mid-morning, the ripple had become a wave. 17 news outlets picked up the clip. Hashtag spread. The wrong seat. DuPont boy. Black Flag Clause talk shows debated whether airlines had lost their moral compass. Former pilots weighed in. So did ethicists. And attorneys. And educators. And then the real bomb dropped. Henrietta DuPont appeared live on the National Ethics Channel, wearing her signature black suit and crimson pin, She sat across from veteran anchor Daniel Reese, calm as stone. "This clause your grandson activated, was it meant to shut down entire airports?" he asked. Henrietta smiled slightly. "It wasn't meant to do anything on its own. The industry designed this system to prevent abuse, but they didn't design themselves to be ethical. That's where it failed." "And you wrote the passenger equity framework nearly a decade ago, is that correct?" "Yes," she said, "but no one signed it, until now." Meanwhile, Julienne and Henrietta had been moved quietly to a private conference room on the executive level. A security officer stood outside the door, not to guard them, but to keep the press out. Julienne sat at the end of a long walnut table, staring at the ethics dashboard glowing on a mounted screen. 19 airports, all red. The interface showed real-time freeze statuses, active investigations, and flagged vendor contracts. "It's more than I expected," Julienne murmured. Henrietta looked over. "It always is. That's why we build systems, Julienne. Not to punish, but to protect. If they're working right, they don't need applause." Julienne nodded. He didn't care about applause anyway. What mattered was clarity. Suddenly, Henrietta's phone buzzed. She glanced at it. "FAA is holding a closed-door press briefing. They're finalizing the passenger equity framework into Federal Register this afternoon." Julienne tilted his head. "They're actually adopting it?" "They don't have a choice anymore," she said. "Your action forced them into precedent. That's how law is born, not from debate, but from necessity." Elsewhere in the airport, CEO Marcus Lang of Atlantic Metro Air, the carrier involved, had just landed in New Orleans. He wasn't smiling. Flanked by legal counsel and 2 PR staffers, he walked briskly through the service corridor toward the operations center. His face was tight, determined. "We're calling a press conference," his comms director whispered. Lang cut him off. "No, not yet. I'm meeting her first." "Her?" Lang's eyes darkened. "DuPont." In the executive lounge, Julienne didn't flinch when the door opened. Marcus Lang stepped in, suit sharp, tie tighter. Julienne stood, instinctively formal, like he had been raised to do. Henrietta remained seated, arms crossed, gaze flat. Lang spoke first. "Ms. DuPont, Mr. DuPont." Henrietta motioned toward the other end of the table. "Sit. You're not here to negotiate. You're here to understand." Lang slowly lowered himself into the chair. Julienne remained standing. Lang looked at him. "You really pulled the clause?" Julienne met his eyes. "I had proof." Lang sighed. "I reviewed the footage. It's bad." Henrietta nodded. "It's not just bad, it's systemic." Lang ran a hand down his face. "We're hemorrhaging trust. Investors, partners, regulators. I want to issue a public apology." "You will," Henrietta said. "I want to announce reforms." "You will. I want you both to stand with us when we do. Show the public we're changing." Julienne looked at his grandmother. Henrietta leaned forward. "Only if you adopt the full passenger equity framework. No watering it down. No backroom edits. And you name it what it is. A reckoning." Lang swallowed hard. Done. By late afternoon, the press conference began. The room was packed. Media, staff, passengers, board members. Julienne stood behind the podium next to Henrietta, staring into the lights. Lang took the mic first. He was measured, contrite. "We failed," he said. "We failed to see a young passenger as equal, as valid, as worthy. And today, we begin making that right." He turned to Julienne. "Because he reminded us of something we forgot." Henrietta stepped forward. "We are introducing the Passenger Equity Framework as mandatory for any airline seeking access to federal or international funding. It will be audited, publicly tracked, and fully enforced." The crowd murmured. Then they applauded. Julienne didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just stood still. That night, in a quiet hotel room 3 blocks from the airport, Julienne sat cross-legged on his bed. typing into a private ethics journal his grandmother had started for him 3 years ago. Today, I learned the difference between silence and stillness. One hides, the other waits. I didn't raise my voice. I raised a standard. Maybe that's louder. Julien Dupont returned to school 3 days later. He slipped through the side entrance of Bishop Grant Middle School wearing a zipped hoodie and a backpack weighted with books and something heavier. Not guilt, not pride, just weight. Half the students stopped talking when he passed. The other half had already seen the video. By lunch, he had a nickname. Jet Boy. "Hey, you gonna shut down the cafeteria next?" A kid from 8th grade jeered, loud enough to draw laughter from 2 tables. Julien didn't flinch. He sat at the far corner of the lunchroom alone, unzipping his bag and pulling out a worn paperback. Ethics and Power Systems. Historical Failures and How They Echo. A hand slapped down on his table. It was Kendrick Price, his closest friend since 2nd grade. Stocky, goofy, and usually late to everything but drama. Kendrick stared at him. "Bro, you blew up 19 airports." "I didn't blow anything up," Julien mumbled. "Dude, CNN said $940 million got locked because of you. You're like, dangerous now." Julien closed the book. "No, I'm visible now. There's a difference." But not everyone at Bishop Grant celebrated visibility. That evening, Julien's locker was graffitied. In red marker, someone had scrawled, "Ethics snitch, fake victim, go back to coach class." He didn't report it. He just wiped it with his sleeve and moved on. Meanwhile, back in D.C., Henrietta Dupont sat before a table of 6 lawyers and 2 former Department of Transportation officials. Her tone was colder than the water bottle at her side. "You're saying the clause Julien triggered, the black flag, is now under petition for suspension?" One of the officials nodded. "There's pressure. The Airline Operators Coalition says the clause is being weaponized against staff." Henrietta raised an eyebrow. "You mean they're upset it works?" Another lawyer cleared her throat. "There's talk of a repeal motion, Senate committee. It's getting attention." Henrietta set down her pen. "Then let's give them attention back." That same night, Julien's inbox filled with emails. Some were from strangers. "Thank you for standing up. My son was mistreated by the same airline last year. You're what real change looks like." Others were different. "Your grandmother bought you power. Stay quiet, kid, or you won't like how fast systems can turn on you." He deleted most, but one caught him. A subject line with just one word. Unseat. Inside was a photo, him walking off the plane, face circled in red. No text, no name. Julien stared at it for a long time, then forwarded it to Henrietta with one word. Logged. The next morning, Henrietta flew to Baton Rouge without alerting anyone. Not the press, not the FAA, not even her security detail. She walked into Julien's school just after 2nd period, dressed in black slacks, a long gray coat, and her signature crimson pin. She waited in the administrative office. Julien spotted her through the glass window and paused. She just nodded. "Time to talk." They drove to a small cafe on Laurel Street. Quiet, familiar. Henrietta spoke first. "You're handling this better than I thought." Julien stirred his tea. "I thought change would feel good, like lighter." Henrietta leaned in. "Real change doesn't feel good, Julien. It feels earned, and earned things have weight." He hesitated. "People say I humiliated her, that I should have just said something on the plane instead of all this." Henrietta's jaw tightened. "You were saying something. They just didn't like the language." At that moment, back in Washington, 2 lobbyists from the Airline Operators Coalition entered a private meeting with Senator Ronald Trask, chair of the Aviation Oversight Subcommittee. Documents slid across the table. One read, "Petition to suspend Ethics Override Clause 4.3.7, the Black Flag Clause." Trask narrowed his eyes. "You sure you want to poke the DuPonts?" "We don't want war," the lead lobbyist said. "Just limits." Trask grinned. That's what hearings are for. That afternoon, Julian met his civics teacher, Mr. Aldridge. The man was quiet, thoughtful, a veteran of protest movements in his youth. He held up a printed article from the New York Times. "Is the black flag clause too powerful for minors?" "What do you think, Julian?" he asked. "Is it too much power for a kid to hold?" Julian stared at the paper, then said, "If adults had done their jobs, I wouldn't have needed it." Aldridge nodded slowly. "Just remember, power doesn't have an age, but responsibility always has a cost." By Friday, news broke. A Senate hearing had been scheduled. The black flag clause would be reviewed, possibly suspended. Airlines wanted it reconsidered. Henrietta's phone rang off the hook. So did Julian's. This time, it was Kendrick calling. "You see this? They're coming after you now. You gonna testify?" Julian was silent. "Bro, this whole thing started with you. You can't disappear now." Julian finally replied, "I'm not disappearing. I'm reloading." At that exact moment, Henrietta was on a call with Chief Counsel of Air Ethica Gateway. "They want our clause gutted," she said. "So we give them two choices." "And what are those?" the counsel asked. "We make it mandatory, or we make it public." A pause. "You're saying full data release?" Henrietta smiled. "Let the world see what happens when we don't have the clause." Back at home, Julian reopened his ethics journal. He typed, "Justice is noisy, but systems are quiet. The wrong seat isn't just a location, it's a signal. Some people build cabins, others rebuild corridors." He closed the laptop, and for the first time all week, he exhaled. Julian DuPont had never been to Capitol Hill, and yet here he was, sitting in a walnut leather chair inside a wood-paneled chamber that smelled like old paper and quiet ambition. A silver placard in front of him read, "Mr. Julian DuPont, Passenger 6F, Atlantic Metro Flight 2282. To his left sat Henrietta, stone-faced as ever. Behind them, murmurs from lobbyists, airline reps, and ethics observers buzzed through the room like static. C-SPAN cameras blinked red. Julian swallowed. The hearing hadn't even started. At precisely 9:02 a.m., Senator Ronald Trask entered the room. He adjusted his gold cufflinks, rapped the gavel once, and looked down his glasses. "This hearing will come to order." Trask leaned forward. "We're here to discuss the Black Flag Clause, its legality, its consequences, and the boy who activated it." The word boy hit like a dart. Julian didn't blink. Henrietta didn't breathe. The first speaker was Graham Lott, General Counsel for the Airline Operators Coalition. A thick man in a tight suit, he gestured toward Julian. "With all due respect," Lott said, "this clause puts too much power in the hands of a minor. No protocol, no checks, just one scan, and an entire airline's ethics score collapses? It's chaos." "Chaos," Henrietta whispered under her breath. "That's what they call accountability now." Julian kept his gaze steady. Then came Representative Mendez from Arizona. She turned her attention directly to Julian. "Young man, can you explain why you didn't simply raise your hand and ask for help during the flight?" Julian leaned into the mic. "Because I've raised my hand before. It didn't work then either." The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Someone coughed. Henrietta gave a tiny nod. Next was Senator Trent McCall, a longtime defender of free enterprise. "This system you activated," he said to Julian, "caused 3 international airports to freeze service. How do you justify that?" Julian looked up. "I didn't freeze airports," he said calmly. "I flagged a pattern. The system responded." "And what pattern is that?" Julian turned toward the monitor beside him. "With permission," he said, "I'd like to display a single chart." Trask gave a bored wave. "Go ahead." The screen came to life with a bar graph. Seat reallocation events, by race. Source: publicly licensed FAA ethics reporting, past 24 months. Julian spoke slowly. These are real-time logs pulled from Skygate Nexus reporting. They show that in over 81% of seat reallocation cases involving underage passengers, Black and Latino children were asked to move, despite having valid boarding passes. A gasp. He changed the slide. Flight 2282, Atlantic Metro, April 14. Assigned seat 6F, Julian DuPont reassigned, without consent. No system record manual override logged Flight Crew Terminal 02A. Julian looked up. I didn't make a call. I made a query. The room went silent. Even Trask sat back. The FAA rep leaned forward. You had access to Skygate Nexus? Julian nodded. Emergency clearance, temporarily extended to me via biometric chain. My grandmother wrote the policy. Henrietta didn't move, didn't smile, didn't need to. 10 seconds passed. Then Trask cleared his throat. Well, that's a lot to unpack. Julian spoke again. Sir, I didn't come here to attack anyone. But if airlines want access to public funding, they shouldn't be afraid of public ethics. After the hearing, the hallways exploded with press. Julian and Henrietta walked silently through the corridor as cameras flashed. A reporter shouted, Julian, are you scared they'll suspend the clause? Julian paused, looked back, then simply said, a seat is never just a seat when someone tells you it's not yours. And he walked on. That night, social media lit up. Clips of Julian's quote went viral. Commentators dissected the data charts. Hashtags trended. #seat justice, #the chart, #DuPont protocol. Even late-night hosts weighed in. This 13-year-old has better ethics documentation than most Fortune 500s. Imagine telling a DuPont to sit in the back. You picked the wrong bloodline, my dude. But it wasn't over. At 11:22 p.m., Henrietta received a call from a blocked number. A voice spoke clearly. If you don't back down, we'll tie the clause to national security risk. Get ready for war. She hung up, looked at the window, then calmly opened her laptop and began writing. In the living room, Julian was on a video call with Kendrick. You killed that hearing, man. Kendrick grinned. That chart? That was game over. Julian shook his head. No, it was the opening statement. Kendrick laughed. You're scaring adults now. Julian smiled. Good. Some of them forgot how to act like one. He returned to his journal. There's a weight to silence, but today, my stillness spoke. Not for revenge, not for praise, but because the numbers don't lie, and neither does the seat. Julian didn't know how many views the clip had gotten. All he knew was that when he walked through the front gates of Bishop Grant Middle School Monday morning, the security guard gave him a nod that felt different. Not forced, not sympathetic, just real. Like, I see you now. But not everyone was clapping. By third period, the whispers had returned. He's the reason my cousin's flight got canceled. $900 million? Over a chair? Even his teacher, Ms. Lanning, seemed awkward as she handed back a graded essay. Julian took it without a word, until a kid at the back yelled, Hey, Jet Boy! How many CEOs cried this week because of you? Julian didn't flinch. He just turned slightly in his seat and said, Depends. How many were scared of the truth? The room went dead silent. Even Ms. Lanning paused. Across the country, something far louder was unfolding. At FAA headquarters, Director Evelyn Rowe stood at a podium flanked by 3 ethics analysts and 2 press officers. Effective immediately, she announced, the FAA will initiate an industry-wide audit of ethics score compliance using the Air Ethica Gateway system. Microphones crackled. Furthermore, she continued, any airline with a score below 78 will be flagged for review and potential route suspension. A reporter called out, Are these changes related to the DuPont hearing? Rowe answered carefully, We are responding to data, and the data doesn't lie. Within hours, the industry cracked. Emails flew. Internal memos leaked. One from Nova Air's executive office read, We need a legal pathway to disassociate from the ethics scoring protocol. Explore emergency injunction options. Another from Aerosky's compliance team. shift public blame to in-flight contractor staff, downplay internal patterns, emphasize isolated incidents, and a confidential message from a senior lobbyist. If DuPont controls the narrative, we all burn. Suspend the system now, or find someone who can. But Henrietta DuPont was already 5 steps ahead. The following morning, she appeared at a surprise press briefing in a sharp gray suit with a small crimson pin at the lapel. Standing at a podium bearing the Air Ethica Gateway seal, she said, "Today, in the interest of public transparency and fair access, we are releasing the real-time ethics scores of all major domestic airlines." She tapped her tablet. A screen behind her lit up. Live Ethics Compliance Dashboard, June 7th. Airline Ethics Score, ESG Eligibility Status Empire. Jet 62, not qualified, under review, Nova Air 68. Not qualified, Frozen Aero Sky 74. Not qualified, pending action, Harmony Wings 79. Qualified, compliant, Crest, Atlantic 81. Qualified, compliant, gasps rippled through the media. Henrietta continued. ESG funds that base investment on transparency and fairness now have data they can trust. We don't punish airlines. We simply measure them. What they do with that is their choice. Back at school, Julienne sat in the library, flipping through a textbook on ethics in civil systems. Principal Rayburn approached quietly. "Julienne," she said, "I wanted to let you know we've received calls from 2 universities requesting interviews with you. Not for admissions, for policy feedback." Julienne looked up. "I'm 13, Rayburn smiled. Apparently they don't care. Meanwhile, the pressure mounted. A coalition of 8 airline lobbying firms filed an emergency petition demanding the temporary suspension of Air Ethica Gateway pending congressional review. Their argument? The system's influence over federal decision-making constitutes undue ethical interference in competitive enterprise. Translation: it works too well. But just as the Senate prepared to deliberate the petition, something unexpected happened. 3 ESG investment funds, representing over $7.2 billion in holdings, released a joint statement. "We will no longer allocate funds to airlines without a verified, real-time ethics score above 78. Transparency is non-negotiable." The pressure flipped. Now airlines were scrambling to climb the ethics ladder they tried to tear down. Henrietta returned to her Georgetown townhouse late that night to find Julienne watching an old documentary on federal whistleblowers. She sat beside him. "Tomorrow might be loud," she said. "The FAA wants me on the advisory panel." Julienne turned to her. "You gonna say yes?" Henrietta gave him a long look. "I built the system to measure truth, Julienne. If they're finally ready to use it, I won't stand in their way." Then she paused. "But I'll make sure they don't break it either." That night, Julienne reopened his journal. "Ethics is the mirror people break before they look in it. They say I caused a freeze. But it wasn't me. It was the temperature they created. All I did was open the window." It was barely 8:15 a.m. when Henrietta DuPont walked through the glass doors of the Federal Aviation Administration's headquarters in Washington, D.C. Her heels clicked once on the marble floor before the security guard, an older black man in uniform, stood and quietly nodded. "Welcome back, Ms. DuPont." She didn't smile, just returned the nod and kept moving. This was no ordinary meeting. Henrietta had just been appointed to the FAA Special Advisory Panel on Ethics and Equity in Commercial Aviation, a committee formed in direct response to Julienne's ethics trigger activation and the subsequent airline collapse. Today was their first session. Inside the conference room, 12 chairs formed a circle. Henrietta took her seat. To her right sat Dr. Ava Morales, a civil rights law professor from NYU. To her left, a tense-looking airline exec from Harmony Wings, who clearly didn't want to be there. FAA Director Evelyn Rowe entered last, holding a folder with a dark blue seal. She cleared her throat. "Today, we consider the draft that's already causing waves before it's even published, the Passenger Equity Framework." Henrietta's fingers rested gently on the printed copy in front of her. She had spent the last 4 nights refining every word. The proposal was bold. Require airlines to publish quarterly ethics reports based on the Air Ethica Gateway system. Mandate racial equity audits for all passenger interactions, flagged via biometric override. Penalize carriers whose scores fall below 75 for more than 2 consecutive quarters. Create a federal review board with passenger voting representation. In short, it was the first real attempt to put power back into the hands of the people who sit in the seats. But the backlash came fast. Within 24 hours of the draft being circulated, the airline lobbying consortium issued a written threat. If the FAA proceeds with endorsing this policy, we will withdraw $1.22 billion in ESG-aligned investments across the airline sector and initiate proceedings in federal court citing overreach and regulatory manipulation. They called it a social engineering attempt dressed in compliance metrics. Henrietta called it accountability. Back in New York, Julien sat in his history class, the last one before lunch. The teacher, Mr. Cowley, was a tall, soft-spoken man with a fondness for ancient empires. Today's lesson was about checks and balances in government. But somehow, as it often did lately, the class shifted toward current events. Cowley gestured toward the screen showing a news headline about Air Ethica. "It's a fascinating case of power shifting too fast," he said, "before all stakeholders can adapt." He looked directly at Julien. Sometimes, when people leapfrog processes, unintended chaos follows. Julien didn't respond immediately, but after a beat, he raised his hand. "So, Macaulay, when civil rights protesters sat in the wrong part of the bus, was that leapfrogging?" The room froze. Even Cowley hesitated, then said softly, "That's not what I meant." Julien nodded. "But maybe it's what it needed to mean." Meanwhile, emails poured into Henrietta's inbox. Some were support letters from disability advocates, veterans groups, and ethics researchers. Others were thinly veiled threats. One simply read, "You touch these systems, and we'll make sure DuPont is a name people fear again." She flagged it, deleted it. Then she pressed send on a new document titled Federal Passenger Integrity Charter, Final Draft. Destination, Congressional Ethics Committee, subsection 4B, Legislative Review. She didn't wait for permission. She just sent it. That evening, Julien came home to find Henrietta in the living room, laptop open, eyes sharp. "You sent it," he said. She looked up. "Of course I did." He sat beside her. "What now?" Henrietta leaned back. "Now we watch the cracks widen, and when the light comes through, we'll make sure it reaches the right people." Elsewhere in Washington, lobbyists scrambled to build a counter-strategy. Internal messages leaked. Shift narrative. Focus on tech overreach. Paint Julien as emotionally unstable. Target Henrietta with ethics violations from her tenure at DuPont Trust. Push for pause legislation, temporary freeze on all ethics trigger activations. But the momentum was no longer in their hands. Public opinion had shifted. Too many people had seen the chart. Too many passengers had been that kid told to move. Late that night, Julien updated his journal again. "They say this isn't how change is supposed to happen, that it should come slowly, through meetings, through votes. But I sat in that seat, and no one asked for a vote when they told me to give it up. So maybe it's okay if change didn't ask either." It started with a headline. Big, bold, and red across morning news tickers. Senator Hollis vows to kill woke sky bill before it takes off. Senator Conrad Hollis, chair of the Commerce Committee, had gone on national television to declare, "We're not turning our airlines into therapy sessions. This DuPont woman and her little code-punching grandson are pushing a social credit system. I'll bury that bill before it lifts one wheel off the runway." Henrietta watched from her kitchen counter, black coffee in one hand, notepad in the other. She didn't blink. She didn't sigh. She simply circled the phrase, "code-punching grandson." Across town, Julien was pulling his hoodie tighter over his head as he crossed the front lawn of Bishop Grant Middle. He felt it before it came. The stairs, the shift in air pressure. 3 kids blocked his path by the lockers. Kevin, from science class, flanked by 2 boys Julian didn't recognize. Kevin crossed his arms. "You think you're some hero now?" Julian didn't answer. Another boy stepped forward. "You got our flights canceled. My dad missed his Vegas trip." Julian stayed still. Kevin leaned closer, voice low. "Why don't you go back to whatever control tower your grandma built?" A hand shoved Julian's shoulder, and before he could even react, Kendrick was there. Kendrick didn't yell, didn't swing. He just walked between them, tall, calm, chin high. "Back off," Kevin scoffed. "Or what?" Kendrick stepped forward. "Or I remind everyone what real weakness looks like, picking fights with kids who use their brain." Kevin hesitated. Julian just stood behind him, steady, saying nothing. The boy stepped back. Kendrick turned to Julian. "You okay?" Julian nodded. "They're scared. That's all." That night, the letter arrived, hand-delivered by a congressional courier. Henrietta opened it, scanned it quickly. "You are hereby summoned to appear before the House Subcommittee on Transport Ethics Oversight." It was signed and sealed. She folded it once, set it on the table, then looked at Julian. "They want a show." Julian looked up from his laptop. "Are you going to give them one?" Henrietta smiled. "I'm going to give them the script." Meanwhile, the media had become a war zone. Some anchors defended Henrietta. "If passengers can be removed mid-flight for their clothes, don't we need standards on how staff behave?" Let's not forget, she didn't break the system. She designed it. Others attacked relentlessly. Who elected her the conscience of the sky? A billionaire and her grandson don't get to write moral law for 300 million people. Julian stayed off social media that week. Instead, he read, he studied. And one night, as Henrietta entered his room, she found him typing on a notepad. "What's that?" she asked. Julian hesitated, then turned the screen toward her. At the top, it read, "Passenger's Oath, a code of dignity for those who serve and those who fly. We, the carriers of breath and time, who rise above borders and seas, acknowledge that every soul in flight deserves respect, regardless of skin, language, age, or seat. We swear to serve not just tickets, but trust. We swear to protect not just bodies, but dignity. We will not shift passengers like luggage. We will not silence pain with policies. We will not see complaints as threats. We will see them as signals. And if the sky is shared, then so must be its justice." Henrietta read it twice. Then she sat beside him. "Julian, this is the policy." He blinked. "It's just a poem." She shook her head. "No, it's the soul the policy forgot." Then she stood up, walked to her office, opened a drawer, and pulled out a file. "Confidential, 2022 Ethics Negotiation Log. Top 4 domestic carriers." She handed it to Julian. Inside were records, meeting transcripts, private emails between airline CEOs and investment lawyers. "They tried to buy silence," she said. "They negotiated to hide the ethics score reports. This was before you ever flew." Julian looked up. "And now?" "Now they're scared because silence doesn't scale." The next morning, Henrietta emailed Julian's oath to every member of the congressional subcommittee. Subject line, "The only policy that ever belonged at 35,000 feet." As she closed her laptop, she whispered, "Let them come." There were 22 cameras in the chamber. Henrietta counted them, not out of nerves, but strategy. She knew exactly which one would pan to her when the questions got ugly. And they would. The mahogany table in front of her felt colder than she expected. 3 microphones, 1 water bottle, a small plaque that read, "Henrietta DuPont, Special Advisor, Air Ethica Gateway." Across the panel sat 7 members of the House Subcommittee on Transport Ethics Oversight. At the center, Senator Conrad Hollis, the same man who had mocked her grandson on live television. He wasted no time. "Ms. DuPont, let's be clear. You designed a system that can shut down $1.7 billion in airline contracts with the push of a button by a child. Henrietta kept her voice calm. With the authentication of a delegate, a temporary credential, yes, but not one granted lightly. Hollis leaned in. That child was your grandson, correct? Yes, sir. So how is this not a personal vendetta wrapped in regulation? Henrietta folded her hands. Let me ask you this, Senator. If a system identifies unethical conduct in real time, and that data is ignored because it makes us uncomfortable, then who exactly are we protecting? Murmurs. The audience stirred. The airlines? She continued. Or the pattern? Another panelist, Representative Monica Evans, jumped in, a former prosecutor with a sharp tone. You claim your grandson was unfairly removed from a seat, but we've seen the footage. There was no physical harm, no slurs, just a reassignment. Henrietta leaned forward. That's the problem, Representative. When dignity is denied without force, we pretend it doesn't count. She paused, then tapped the folder in front of her. And in aviation, patterns matter more than punches. Hollis tried again. So what now? You want us to legislate feelings? Henrietta didn't blink. I want you to legislate standards. Feelings are volatile, standards are measurable. Then, without raising her voice, she opened a folder marked Exhibit C. Inside was Julian's handwritten document, the passenger's oath. Henrietta placed it gently before the panel. This was written by the child you called dangerous. It doesn't crash planes. It doesn't freeze bank accounts. It simply says, protect dignity as you would protect altitude. She paused. And yet, that's the part we fear. The room fell into a stillness. It wasn't silence. It was recognition. Evans leaned back in her chair. Even Hollis looked unsettled. 5 minutes later, just as Henrietta stepped off the floor and into the hallway, her assistant rushed over. It's live. What is? Julian's oath. We turned it into a voiceover video. It's on every platform now. Henrietta raised an eyebrow. Who voiced it? A group of real flight attendants. We got 17 of them. They insisted. The video went viral in under an hour. Over 3.2 million views in 3 hours. The voice of an older black woman came through the speakers, solemn and warm. We, the carriers of breath and time, who rise above borders and seas. Clips of crying babies, of wheelchair users waiting, of silent passengers clutching boarding passes. Acknowledge that every soul in flight deserves respect. Cut to security footage. A teen quietly asked to move. Then another. A woman being told her outfit was inappropriate. We swear to protect not just bodies, but dignity. Airline break rooms across the country began playing the clip. Some crew members rolled their eyes, but most watched in stillness. In a quiet terminal lounge at LAX, 4 flight attendants, 1 Filipino, 1 white, 1 Latina, 1 black, stood together at the end of their shift. One of them pulled out a printed copy of the oath. I'm framing this. Another nodded. Put it up in the crew lounge. Let them see what flying's supposed to mean. They signed it, one by one, then taped it next to the coffee machine. Back in D.C., Henrietta sat in her hotel room, shoes off, news on. Julian FaceTimed her from New York. You killed it. Henrietta smiled. You did. He shook his head. They don't listen to kids, Grandma. Not really. Henrietta raised her glass of sparkling water. They don't, but they read what they leave behind. Julian paused, then asked quietly, Do you think the oath changes anything? Henrietta stared out the window at the Capitol. No oath changes people, but it reminds them who they promised to be. It had been 22 days since Henrietta testified before Congress, and in that time, the landscape of American aviation had begun to tilt. The FAA announced a formal investigation into discriminatory practices in commercial airlines. The first policy under review, the proposed Flight Ethics Trigger Protocol, a real-time biometric and behavioral reporting system that allows ethics delegates to flag misconduct in transit, initiating a review across the Air Ethica Gateway. It was the very system Julian had activated, and now they wanted him. Julian was sitting at the kitchen table, stirring cereal he no longer intended to eat when the call came. Henrietta answered on speaker. "This is the Office of Congressional Affairs," the voice said. "We're extending a formal invitation for your grandson to appear before the Joint Subcommittee as a civilian ethics delegate." Henrietta's hand tensed on the edge of the table. "He's 13. "We're aware. That's precisely why the committee believes it's vital to hear from him." Later that day, Henrietta paced the living room, frustration radiating off her. "They're going to try to turn this into a circus." Julianne watched her. What if it isn't? She froze. What? What if it's not a trap? What if it's a moment? Henrietta narrowed her eyes. Julianne stood straighter. "You always say, systems bend when someone dares to speak without asking for permission." Well, he took a breath. "I didn't ask when they told me to move, and I'm not asking now." The hearing room. The room was larger this time. Not just a subcommittee, a joint session. The FAA, Department of Transportation, and Congressional Aviation Ethics Council all present. Cameras, national broadcast, standing room only. Julianne walked in wearing a navy suit slightly too big, his hair combed, his eyes clear. Henrietta sat in the gallery, hands clasped. Senator Hollis opened the floor. "We're here to evaluate the risks and validity of allowing minors access to sensitive digital override tools within federal transport systems. Mr. Thornhill, you may begin." Julianne adjusted the mic. It screeched once, then silence. "My name is Julianne Thornhill. I'm 13. I live in New York City. I fly about twice a month because my parents work overseas. I like chess. I like systems. I like figuring out how things work." He looked up. "That's probably why I noticed when they asked me to leave my seat. The way they didn't ask anyone else. The way they didn't look at me like I belonged." A congressman interjected. "Julian, did you feel physically threatened?" "No, sir." "Were there any slurs used? Raised voices?" "No, just smiles. Cold ones." "Then how do you define harm?" Julianne didn't blink. "By what it leaves behind." The room quieted. Another rep asked, "Do you regret activating the system?" Julianne considered that. "No, because systems don't care if you're 13, but people do. And sometimes, that's the problem." A woman from the FAA leaned forward. "Julianne, do you think every child should have that kind of power?" Julianne gave a small smile. "Not every child, just the ones you don't usually listen to." That line landed hard. The room fell into a stunned, breath-held stillness. Henrietta looked on, eyes glistening. Hollis leaned in again. "Let's be honest, son. Isn't it dangerous to let emotion dictate national airspace policy?" Julianne nodded. "Absolutely. That's why the system didn't activate just on emotion. It used behavior recognition, AI bias metrics, and a protocol your committee approved." He paused. "So if you're asking whether I acted alone, no. I acted with a system you built. The only difference is I didn't look like who you expected to use it." After the hearing, Julianne stepped out into the hallway lined with reporters. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Social media erupted. "That kid just exposed an entire committee without raising his voice. Julianne Thornhill is 13, and he just taught Congress what equity actually means." That evening, the FAA issued a public statement. "Effective immediately, the Flight Ethics Trigger Protocol will be piloted in 5 national hubs. Passenger delegates will be appointed under strict biometric oversight and accountability." But it was the next part that made headlines. The Ethics Charter, upon final federal approval, will include as its preamble the passenger's oath, authored by civilian delegate Julian Thornhill. Back in New York, Julian sat at his desk, quiet. Henrietta entered, holding a newspaper. The front page read, "The boy who spoke and was finally heard." She set it down. They approved it. Julianne didn't react, just whispered, "Now we wait for someone to read it before their next flight." Henrietta stepped closer. They already have. You didn't just trigger a system, Julian. You reminded people that the sky isn't just shared. It has to be just too. It started with a signature. One flight attendant in Denver printed out the passenger's oath and taped it to the inside of the crew storage closet. Another in Atlanta laminated it and placed it inside the safety announcement folder. Within days, the oath was appearing across terminals and lounges, printed in 9 different languages. No one had told them to do it. No one had told them they couldn't, and that was the point. In the weeks following the FAA's announcement, 5 pilot airports were selected for the trial implementation of the Flight Ethics Trigger Protocol: JFK, LAX, O'Hare, Hartsfield-Jackson, and Dallas-Fort Worth. The industry braced itself. The union stirred. The lobbyists circled like sharks. But passengers, they watched and waited. Henrietta and Julian sat quietly in the back of a closed FAA press briefing in D.C. The administrator stepped up to the podium. "We are entering a new phase of accountability in aviation. No longer will dignity be secondary to efficiency. Ethics now sits in the cockpit, right next to safety." The room applauded softly. But not everyone was clapping. A representative from the airline coalition stood outside moments later, cameras flashing. "This ethics experiment is a political stunt that risks chaos in our national airways. We need pilots, not poetry." That line went viral, and not in the way he intended. Back in New York, Julian received a letter, a handwritten envelope, no return address. Inside was a card with one line: "I was the passenger they gave your seat to. I'm sorry. You taught me something I should have known long ago." Julian sat with it for a while, then tucked it into a small box on his shelf, a box labeled "Things They Couldn't Say Out Loud." The first flight. The first official flight using the Flight Ethics Trigger System took off from JFK 2 weeks later. An elderly Vietnamese woman, Mrs. Lien Tran, was traveling with her son. Her boarding pass had been flagged for secondary reassignment due to age-related boarding accommodation. Translation? They were about to bump her seat again. A newly appointed passenger delegate, a middle-aged Dominican schoolteacher named Ramon Cordero, received an alert on his tablet. The system flagged bias patterns. 3 older Asian passengers moved in the past 4 days under similar language. Ramon pressed escalate. The protocol kicked in. A supervisor arrived. The reassignment was halted. Mrs. Tran boarded as scheduled. Seat 6C, window. No fuss, no cameras, just silence, and a new system that noticed. Back in D.C., a quiet revolution was underway. The Passenger Equity Framework, an extension of the oath, was submitted to Congress as a joint federal resolution, drafted by the FAA, endorsed by over 80 advocacy groups, and prefaced with a single paragraph written by a 13-year-old boy. Every seat has a story. Every passenger, a right to dignity. Ethics should not be optional at 30,000 feet. The final test came at the annual Global Aviation Ethics Forum in Geneva. Henrietta had been invited to speak, but instead, she sent someone else. Julian. Wearing a slightly better-fitting suit this time, he stood in front of an audience of executives, regulators, pilots, and ethicists from 42 countries. He looked nervous until he started. "I don't run an airline. I don't write policy. I didn't ask to be here, but maybe that's exactly why I am." He paused. "When I activated that protocol, I didn't want anyone punished. I just didn't want to feel invisible. You build systems that move bodies. I'm asking you to build ones that recognize souls." The room fell quiet. Then, a slow, rising applause. 2 months later, the Passenger Ethics Accord passed with bipartisan support. All U.S. airlines were required to undergo quarterly ethics audits. Delegate systems were expanded to 19 airports. The passenger's oath was translated into 17 languages, posted in every federally regulated terminal. Julian's name was quietly added to a commemorative plaque in the FAA's Ethics Innovation Hall, but no one told him. Henrietta found out first. One evening, Henrietta and Julianne walked through JFK's Terminal 4, where it all started. A mural now hung over the international boarding gate. Dozens of flight crew signatures surrounded a printed version of the oath. Underneath it, in bold, in honor of those who spoke when it was easier to be silent. Julian stared for a moment. Henrietta watched him. "I didn't think it would get this far," he said. "That's how you know it was worth it." He turned. "Do you think they'll forget?" Henrietta smiled. "Systems do, but people remember stories, and this one's just beginning." 3 months after the Passenger Ethics Accord passed, something strange started happening. Not dramatic, not loud, just different. A white businessman at LAX asked a Latina mother to quiet her toddler. The flight attendant approached, and instead of echoing the complaint, she crouched down, handed the child a coloring book, and asked the man if he needed noise-canceling headphones. No escalation, no side glances, just awareness. Because behind her, taped to the drink cart, was a laminated version of Julian Thornhill's passenger oath. Across terminals in Seattle, Detroit, Newark, and Dallas, the oath had quietly made its way not into official manuals, but into culture. Crews began memorizing it. Some even recited it before takeoff, like a silent mantra. It wasn't required. It wasn't performative. It was protective. And passengers noticed. In Houston, a disabled veteran named Marcus Green boarded a domestic flight to Phoenix. His service dog, Jasper, sat neatly at his feet. A gate agent frowned. "Animals aren't allowed in row 2. Before she could finish, the system pinged. Ramon Cordero, the delegate from earlier flights, had moved to Houston and was on duty. His terminal flagged the moment. He walked over. "Sir, you and Jasper are fine where you are. If anyone has questions, they can direct them to me." The agent hesitated. Ramon held eye contact. "We don't move passengers because their presence makes people uncomfortable. That's not how we fly anymore." No report filed, no news story, just dignity. The ripple effect continued. Sky Vista, one of the last major carriers to oppose the Ethics Accord, signed on after their CEO's 14-year-old son was asked to switch seats on a flight for business class image continuity. Unity Jet, a private airline, began offering ethics briefings to their elite clients, reminding them that power doesn't entitle priority. 2 flight academies began integrating the passenger oath into training for new pilots and attendants. For the first time in decades, the word respect appeared more often in training modules than protocol. But not everyone celebrated. At a high-level aviation leadership conference in Orlando, several airline executives expressed growing concerns. If we let behavior be policed by emotion, we're asking for chaos. Passengers will weaponize the system to get upgrades or discounts. What happens when someone falsely triggers the protocol? Henrietta was invited as a keynote speaker. She listened carefully, then replied, "You're worried about false alarms. I'm worried about the ones that were real and never recorded." The room grew still. "We built systems that can detect turbulence before it hits, but we couldn't recognize when someone was being silently humiliated in seat 12B. This isn't about punishing airlines. It's about rebuilding trust." Meanwhile, back in New York, Julian faced a decision. He'd been invited to join the FAA's Youth Ethics Advisory Board, a pilot program designed to gather feedback on new aviation policies directly from young passengers. But it came with responsibility and pressure. Julian hesitated. What if I mess it up? What if they only listen because it's a trending story? Henrietta answered, "Then speak anyway. If they're only listening because it's trending, at least they're listening. And when the trend fades, the story won't, because the system you touched is still working." Julian accepted. At his first board meeting, he said just one thing. "We shouldn't build systems to protect people like me because I was the victim. We should build them so that you don't need another victim at all." That quote landed on the cover of Aviation Reform Quarterly. By the end of the year, 5 other countries, Canada, the UK, Germany, South Korea, and Brazil, initiated talks with the U.S. Department of Transportation. Their goal? To replicate the Passenger Ethics Accord in international terminals, and they wanted to license Air Ethica Gateway to integrate into their digital travel systems. Henrietta received a phone call from a French official. Madame Dupont, it appears your grandson has redesigned more than policy. He's redefined what it means to board a plane with pride. Back in the States, one final change arrived. Quiet, but powerful. The FAA issued an internal update. All crew training simulations would now include dignity encounters, scenarios where unconscious bias could influence treatment, intentionally designed to train awareness over authority. The simulations were named Thornhill Moments, not in honor of the mistake, but in honor of the one who noticed. Julian was invited to attend the unveiling of the first full integration of the flight ethics trigger in a foreign airport, London Heathrow. As the plane descended, a soft chime played in the cabin. Then came an announcement, not by the pilot, but a pre-recorded voice. It was Henrietta's. Ladies and gentlemen, this aircraft observes the Passenger Ethics Accord. All travelers are entitled to safe passage and equal dignity. If you feel mistreated or witness a violation, please speak to your onboard ethics delegate. Because here, equity doesn't wait for turbulence to act. Julianne sat in seat 14A, eyes wide. The flight attendant passed by, noticed him, and whispered, "Heard of the kid who started this?" Julianne smiled. "Yeah, I've heard of him." Julianne leaned back in his seat as the wheels touched down at Heathrow. The cabin lights dimmed, and he felt something shift. Not just inside the plane, but inside himself. It was a strange feeling. One he hadn't had since that first flight when everything had gone wrong. But this time, the quiet felt earned. As passengers began gathering their belongings, the man sitting next to him, a middle-aged black professor returning from a lecture tour, looked over. "You're American, right?" he asked. Julianne nodded. "Did you hear what they said in the announcement?" Julianne gave a small smile. "I wrote it." The man blinked, stunned. "You're that kid?" Julianne didn't answer right away, but then he said softly, "I'm just someone who got lucky enough that people listened." The professor extended his hand. "No, son, you made them listen." At the baggage carousel, a small group of airport staff wearing purple vests approached him. One of them, a tall woman with a Scottish accent, introduced herself as the Global Integration Officer for the Ethics Accord at Heathrow. "Julianne, I hope you don't mind," she said, "but there's someone who would very much like to meet you." They led him through a side corridor, past immigration, and into a private office. Waiting there was a woman in a gray suit, flanked by two interpreters. She was from ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. "We are planning to propose the Ethics Accord as a foundation for international passenger rights," she said. "But it's not just legal frameworks we need, it's stories." Julianne raised an eyebrow. "You mean mine?" "No," she replied. "I mean the people your story helped protect. We want to film them, record their voices, capture what changed because one boy said no." It was the first time Julianne felt the weight of what had really happened. It wasn't just about him anymore. It never really had been. Later that week, while waiting at the airport lounge for his return flight, Julianne watched a new training video playing on a nearby screen. It wasn't flashy, no dramatic music, just real crew members sharing stories of when they chose to act differently and what it meant to the people on board. One of them was Ramon. He looked into the camera and said, "I used to think following rules made me a good employee, but after that day with Jasper and Mr. Green, I realized following rules isn't enough. We have to follow people." Another was a young woman from Brazil. She recalled intervening when an elderly Japanese tourist was mocked for not understanding the boarding signs. She had guided him by hand to his gate, refusing to let him be embarrassed. It turned out the man was a retired engineer who had worked on the first Boeing 747s. He just smiled and said, "This is the first flight in a long time that didn't feel like work." Julianne sat silently, watching those clips. Across the lounge, A young boy around 10, with a small backpack and a badge that read Autism Support, was checking in at the desk. When the agent looked confused, another attendant gently stepped in. "He's part of the pre-board protocol. Let me handle it." No fuss, no delay, just action. Julien saw himself in that boy, not in what had happened, but in what didn't. And that, he thought, is the point. When his return flight boarded, the pilot made a brief announcement. "On behalf of the flight crew and all of us committed to the Ethics Accord, welcome aboard. You are seen, you are valued, you belong." As the plane lifted into the sky, Julien closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to remember. Not the worst day of his life, but the day it changed the world. 6 months later, Henrietta DuPont sat quietly in her sunlit study in the Upper East Side. The room smelled faintly of jasmine tea and old books, a space where decisions were once whispered but now echoed across continents. She was holding a letter. Not an email, a real letter, with thick parchment and an embossed crest at the top. The Office of the Secretary General, United Nations. Julien walked in, wearing a dark blazer over a wrinkled t-shirt. Typical. He handed her a mug of tea, then saw the letter. "What's that?" Henrietta didn't answer right away. She just passed it to him. Julien scanned the text, then blinked. "You're kidding." Henrietta shook her head, smiling softly. Apparently not. The letter invited her to address the UN General Assembly, not as a diplomat, not even as a corporate leader, but as an architect of global ethics reform. The subject line was titled, "Dignity as Infrastructure." Julien let out a low whistle. "That's heavy." Henrietta laughed. "You froze $940 million in contracts from a seat by the window. I think you'll survive watching your grandmother speak." They both knew this moment wasn't about a single flight anymore. Across the globe, airlines had quietly adopted the passenger equity framework. What began as an override clause in a young boy's emergency login had now evolved into a full-fledged international charter. Crew training was different. Hiring policies had changed. Passenger complaints were now audited for bias patterns, with monthly reports sent to civil ethics boards. Even ESG investment firms, once fixated on carbon footprints and governance compliance, now included dignity scores in airline evaluations. The ripple was undeniable. In Nairobi, Kenya, a teenage girl named Aisha, who used a wheelchair, boarded her first plane. The attendant who greeted her had a badge pinned to his vest. "Passenger dignity trained. Ask me anything." In Tokyo, a non-binary traveler wrote an op-ed in Japan Times, describing how they were treated not just politely, but like a person, not a risk, for the first time in their flying life. And in Montreal, a passenger quietly flagged an incident involving a French-speaking Haitian family being told they didn't belong in business class. The crew didn't argue. They reviewed the report, suspended the flight lead, and followed up. With public transparency. Julien kept track of these stories. He wasn't addicted to fame, but he was committed to impact. One afternoon, he got a call from the director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. "We'd like to display the original boarding pass from that day as part of a new exhibit on modern civil rights movements." Julien was stunned. "It's still in my drawer, bent in half." The director replied, "Perfect. That's how history should look. Bent, but not broken." Back home, Henrietta began preparing her UN speech, but something kept bothering her. Not about the words, but about the message. Julien noticed. "Everything okay?" She nodded, then paused. "There's one thing left to do." The next morning, Henrietta made a call to the FAA Chief Ethics Officer and requested a closed session meeting with the Senate Committee on Transportation Oversight. Her proposal? A legally binding clause within the FAA's certification standards. No airline, domestic or foreign, could receive U.S. flight clearance without meeting passenger integrity minimums, which included bias neutral seat allocation systems, independent in-flight ethics observers for transcontinental routes, real-time passenger dignity flag systems, annual transparency audits. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a standard, and she wanted it written into law. 2 months later, the Senate passed the DuPont Thornhill Aviation Integrity Act, a bipartisan bill with rare unanimous support. Julien didn't even know they were naming it after him. He found out when the press called asking for comment. His response? "I didn't write the law. I just asked a question no one else dared to ask. Why me?" As autumn arrived, Henrietta flew to Geneva to deliver her speech at the UN. The hall was full. Delegates from 92 countries seated in rows under soft blue lights. She stepped up to the podium, spoke clearly, calmly, then ended with this: "Technology has made our world smaller, but dignity is what makes it livable. And if an algorithm can crash markets in seconds, then one choice, one policy, can restore humanity just as fast." The room erupted into a standing ovation. But Henrietta didn't smile until she saw Julien, watching from the back, hand on his heart, eyes full of quiet pride. That night, they returned to their hotel. Julien flopped onto the couch, exhausted. Henrietta sat beside him, took his hand, and whispered, "You've changed more than the system, darling. You've changed the expectation." Julien leaned his head on her shoulder. "We didn't fix everything." "No," she agreed. "But now they know they can't ignore it." Outside, the Geneva sky sparkled. Inside, history had already landed. And this time, no one was asked to give up their seat. Tell us where you're watching from, and if you have ever been mistreated while flying. Did someone ever make you feel like you didn't belong, just because of how you looked, sounded, or where you sat? Drop your story in the comments. You never know who might need to hear it today. She tore the ticket in half, then smiled. "Maybe next time dress like you belong here," the flight attendant said, her voice coated with honeyed venom. The two halves of the first-class boarding pass fluttered down into the trash beside the gate like confetti at the wrong celebration. Naomi Sinclair didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, watching. Behind her, a short line of business travelers grew awkwardly quiet. One man glanced at his phone, pretending not to notice. A woman in designer heels exhaled, annoyed that boarding had paused for someone who clearly didn't fit the section. Captain Harold Brent stepped forward from the cabin. Tall, trim, mid-50s, face set like poured concrete. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, even though he'd seen it all. The flight attendant, Margot Steele, according to her gold-plated name tag, gave him a quick, conspiratorial shrug. "No priority verification. Attempted to board first." Harold looked Naomi up and down. Blouse lightly wrinkled. Slacks not quite pressed. No luxury handbag. No glossy boarding pass, and, perhaps worst of all, no fear in her eyes. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "unless you can show digital clearance or elite status, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside and let real first-class passengers through." Real. That word echoed. A few heads turned at that, but no one said a thing. Naomi remained perfectly still. She didn't shout, didn't defend herself. She just looked from Margot to Harold with calm precision. And then she smiled, not out of amusement, but out of memory. She'd seen this before, not just in airports, but in boardrooms, in funding pitches, in hotel lobbies and VIP lounges. The same look, the same tone, the same assumption. You don't belong. But that's the thing about assumptions. They rarely survive a fact. Naomi lifted her wrist slowly, glancing at her smartwatch. Grid alert. Unethical behavior detected. Flight CS-147. Incident flagged. Activate grid lock? She tapped no, not yet. Timing mattered. Beside her, Margot crossed her arms, still standing between Naomi and the cabin door. "We've asked politely, ma'am. If you don't comply, we'll call security." Naomi looked past her. Row 1A, window seat. Hers. She spoke quietly. "You just tore federal property." Harold scoffed. "Ma'am, that was a boarding pass, not a presidential document." Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly. That pass was issued under SkyGrid oversight, which means it's logged. Harold frowned. Margot blinked. Someone behind Naomi muttered, "Wait, what's SkyGrid?" No one answered, because right then, everything froze. Not literally, but in that kind of eerie, pressure-filled pause before the storm breaks. Naomi stepped aside, not to back away, but to reach into her carry-on. She pulled out a replacement pass, identical in appearance, unbranded, low-key, and she held it up, not for them, but for the security camera blinking quietly in the corner. "Let the system decide," she said. Harold's patience snapped. "Security to Gate 3A. Possible unruly passenger, requesting backup." A man 3 rows behind whispered to his wife, "This is why they need to screen better." Margot leaned into Naomi one last time. "You're not flying first class today. Let it go." Naomi's smartwatch vibrated again. Gridlock protocols standing by. Confirm. Yes. No. She tapped yes. A soft ping barely audible beneath the hum of the cabin. That was all it took. At the SkyGrid command center in DC, red lights began blinking on a black screen. Within 20 seconds, 4 U.S. airports received signal disruptions. Within 45, FAA received an ethics flag from a Level 1 credentialed authenticator. By the 1-minute mark, 152 flights, including this one, were frozen from takeoff across the SkyGrid platform. Captain Harold Brent had no idea his career had just ended in that same minute. The woman he tried to remove wasn't just a passenger. She was the architect and final authenticator of the very system that allowed him to fly. Naomi sat in 1A, quiet, poised. She pulled out her tablet and began writing notes, not for vengeance, for documentation. From the row behind her, a young tech analyst named Liana watched, breath held. She didn't know exactly who Naomi was, but something told her she was witnessing a shift in the air. And far behind them, in the general boarding section, a travel blogger named Ethan Collins took a discreet photo, captioning it for a post that would go viral within the hour. They denied her the seat. 5 minutes later, they lost the sky. Sinclair Protocol had telltales of power. The cabin hadn't moved, not an inch. But the air, it got heavier. Naomi could feel it pressing against her shoulders, against her lungs. The kind of weight that came not from altitude or pressure, but from eyes. The kind that burned sideways, from behind newspapers, over the rims of champagne glasses. She sat quietly in 1A, spine straight, tablet resting on her lap. Row 1B was empty, but every seat behind it had turned into a theater seat, watching her, judging, whispering. She didn't need to hear the words. She'd lived them before. 3 rows behind, a man in a navy blazer leaned toward his wife. "She's just trying to make a scene," he muttered. "Why don't they just move her already?" someone else whispered. A young woman with a designer tote clutched it closer to her chest and crossed her legs the other way, as if to place more distance between her and whatever she thought Naomi represented. At the front of the plane, Margot tapped furiously on her tablet. "Passenger, Sinclair, Naomi seat 1A. Status, unverified flag. Disruptive." Just like that, with the flick of 2 fingers, Margot digitally sealed Naomi's fate. At least, as far as the airline's internal system was concerned. She didn't bother verifying the SkyGrid credentials, didn't check the passenger manifest against real-time FAA clearances. No barcode scan, no identity check. Just vibes and a touch of control. Across the screen popped a suggested tag from the crew's internal tool, "Recommend removal before takeoff." Margot pressed confirm. Back in her seat, Naomi's smartwatch buzzed quietly. She glanced down. No emotion, just acknowledgement. Behavior log active. Flight CS-147. Cabin recording enabled, Captain. Brent, Harold. Lead FA, Steele, Margot System. Note, disruptive flag entered without verification. She didn't need to say a word. SkyGrid was already watching. Further back, in row 8C, Ethan Collins lifted his phone slightly and pressed record. He wasn't live streaming. Not yet. But something in his gut told him to capture this. The energy in the cabin had changed. He'd flown enough to know what quiet prejudice looked like, and this wasn't quiet anymore. It was systemic. It was orchestrated. And the woman they were trying to humiliate? She didn't flinch, didn't even blink. That stillness made Ethan pause. He typed a quick note in his app. Flight CS-1447, woman in 1A flagged without cause. Entire crew ignoring protocols. FAA will want this. Then he looked around the cabin. Not a single passenger had spoken up. Not even to ask, "Are you sure she's in the wrong?" Silence, as always, was louder than any slur. Captain Harold Brent peeked from the cockpit, his headset hanging around his neck. He didn't speak to Naomi. He didn't speak to anyone. But he gave Margot a look. The kind of look that said, "Wrap it up and get her out." Margot nodded once, as if it were routine. A few minutes passed. Still no pushback from the gate. The door remained open. Naomi stayed seated, one leg crossed neatly over the other, hands resting on her carry-on. She opened her tablet, tapped in a password only she knew, and unlocked a monitoring panel no one in the cabin had ever seen. SkyGrid, live incident console. Status, passive monitoring, public layer activated visible. 2. FAA Ethics Board. Transcom Oversight. Legal Review. Pending with one swipe, she tagged the incident manually. Tag: profiling, public humiliation, systemic collusion. Suspected. Her fingers didn't shake. Her pulse didn't spike. This wasn't revenge. It was record-keeping. Back near the bulkhead, Richard White, the man in the slick gray suit, leaned toward the businessman next to him and sneered just loud enough for Naomi to hear. "Looks like Zenith's letting just anyone into first class these days. What's next? Lottery boarding?" The man beside him chuckled. Not loudly, just enough to show agreement. Naomi heard it, didn't react, but SkyGrid did. Incident flagged. Passenger-to-passenger hostility, P2P bias, voice pattern captured, audio file stored. The system didn't forget, and neither did she. Ethan glanced down at his phone. A tweet formed in his head. "Black woman flagged as disruptive without protocol. No ID check, no scan, just bias. Flight CS1447. FAA should look at this." Ethics fail. But he didn't post it yet. Not yet. He looked at her again. There was something deliberate in her posture, something unnervingly calm, almost like she was letting it build. In the front galley, Margot whispered into her headset. "She's refusing to move. We've flagged her. Ready for ground security?" "Confirmed," came the reply from the gate agent. But as she tapped the final override into the system, the tablet flashed red. "Error. Access suspended. SkyGrid ethics lock. Tier 1. Hold initiated." Margot frowned. Harold stepped out again, annoyed. "What now?" The cockpit intercom suddenly buzzed. "Captain, air traffic control just flagged our flight for delay. System-wide issue. Something about authorization syncing." Harold muttered a curse and marched back inside. Naomi didn't even look up. In her lap, the tablet displayed new alerts. Gridlock activated. FAA notification confirmed. 152 flights on hold. Ethics verification triggered. Her eyes narrowed, just slightly. Outside the window, the sky remained clear. The sun glinted off the tarmac. Everything looked normal. But inside that cabin, beneath the stillness, a storm was starting to gather. And no one, not Margot, not Harold, not Richard, had the faintest idea how close they were to losing everything they thought they controlled. The odd thing wasn't the silence. It was how long it lasted. For nearly a full minute, the entire first-class cabin sat in stillness. No rustling of newspapers, no clink of glassware, not even the whisper of a polite cough. Just stillness. Naomi remained seated, hands folded gently over her tablet, her carry-on tucked neatly beneath her seat. She hadn't moved since tapping her wrist, since confirming the command that, unseen to nearly everyone, had already begun reshaping the air traffic control network from coast to coast. She didn't need to look around. She could feel the shift. Ethan Collins could feel it too. From row 8C, his camera was rolling. Not just a photo, not a one-off clip. A full video now, recording the stillness, the tension, the invisible pressure swirling around one black woman in 1A. He focused on her hands. Still, calm. Too calm. He whispered to himself, "This ain't her first time." Ethan glanced at his phone and began typing. Quick, efficient. Flight CS147. Passenger flagged without ID check. Cabin crew ignoring protocols. Woman in 1A isn't reacting. She's watching, like she knows something they don't. SkyGrid Natural Ethics Alert. Telltales. He paused before hitting post, then glanced up at Naomi again. She hadn't even blinked. He posted. A ripple of murmurs finally broke the silence. It started somewhere in row 5. She's not even saying anything. Must be a fraud trying to sneak into first. No, did you see the tablet she's holding? That didn't look cheap. Still, she doesn't belong up there. A man 2 seats back muttered, "FAA should clean this kind of thing up." Naomi heard every word. She didn't turn, didn't react. Instead, her eyes flicked briefly to the corner of her tablet, where the small SkyGrid overlay blinked green. Gridlock engaged. FAA alert distributed. 152 flights on ethics hold. Tell us, have you ever watched someone turn the tables without saying a word? Just sit back and pay attention. This is how real power moves. Up in the cockpit, Captain Harold Brent slammed his headset down. This doesn't make sense. We just got full tower clearance 5 minutes ago. First Officer Langford scrolled through the new notice on the flight deck's display. Captain, it's not the tower, it's SkyGrid. They've placed a Tier 1 ethics hold on our transponder code. Harold frowned. SkyGrid? That's just for communications. What the hell does ethics have to do with our flight path? Langford looked confused. I thought SkyGrid was only passive monitoring, he said slowly. But this looks different. Then he read the last line on the screen out loud. Command Origin, CEO, Final Authenticator. Sinclair, Naomi Harold went pale. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Margot's tablet stopped responding. A red error flashed across her screen. Access denied. SkyGrid lock active. Do not override. What? She hissed under her breath. She tapped again. Nothing. She looked up and locked eyes with Naomi for the first time in 10 minutes. Naomi just blinked. Once. And in that blink, Margot knew. This woman wasn't a passenger. She was the system. Back in the terminal, a young staffer at Clear Sky HQ in Atlanta checked the National Flight dashboard and gasped. Hey, has anyone looked at this? We've got 152 aircraft grounded, simultaneously. Her supervisor leaned in. Where? She pointed. Denver, Miami, Newark, Chicago, LAX, all in SkyGrid control zones. The supervisor's eyes widened. No way this is a glitch. It's not, she said, scrolling down. They've flagged our entire fleet under ethics violation review. By the 20-minute mark, FAA Command had received 3 flagged reports from the SkyGrid oversight system, each linking to one source. Dr. Naomi Sinclair, Gridlock authenticated, Tier 1 lockdown activated. By the 30-minute mark, Twitter/X was on fire. Ethan's post had been reposted by @JusticeAviator, then @Women's Rights Daily, then @DataWatchHQ. It wasn't just about a woman denied a seat anymore. It was about a system called SkyGrid and the woman who'd built it. At the far end of the first-class cabin, Richard White was no longer smug. He had stopped whispering, stopped tapping his Rolex for attention. Now, he was frozen, watching his stock tickers glitch, watching the cabin crew panic, watching the woman he'd mocked sit still like gravity itself bowed to her. He didn't understand what she'd done, but he understood one thing. This was going to cost. Ethan's second tweet went up with a short clip. Naomi sitting, the cabin crew frantic, the pilot re-entering the aisle. She never raised her voice, but the airline just lost access to the sky. Sinclair protocol, #grid locked. Inside her tablet, Naomi opened one final panel. She tapped in a secure code. FAA Legal Sync activated. Sinclair protocol, drafted, pending public disclosure. It was no longer about a seat. It never had been. It was about whether this industry deserved to operate without consequence. The rules were already written. Now they were being enforced. Silently, swiftly, publicly. Captain Harold Brent had been flying for 27 years. He'd flown through thunderstorms over the Rockies, landed during a hurricane warning in Miami, once even had to manually reset a corrupted flight nav system mid-air. But he'd never not once seen a hold like this, and certainly not for ethics. What do you mean we're suspended? He barked into the comm. The voice on the other end, Calvin from FAA Tower, sounded calm, but clipped. Captain Brent, your flight has been placed under Tier 1 gridlock. No departure authorization can be granted until SkyGrid Review clears your ethics score. Harold gritted his teeth. We're a plane, not a damn HR case. Respectfully, sir, Calvin replied. That's exactly the point. In the cabin, passengers began to stir. The captain's voice hadn't come over the intercom yet, but people felt it. That buzz of discomfort, that something went wrong tension in the air. A woman in row 4 muttered, "Why aren't we moving?" A man in 2C flipped open his laptop, tried connecting to in-flight Wi-Fi. Nothing. "Still boarding?" someone asked. "No," another replied. "They closed the door 20 minutes ago." A few heads turned forward, toward Naomi. She hadn't moved. Margot Steele was sweating. Not visibly, not yet. But her neck felt damp and her jaw tight. She tapped her tablet again and again, but every function returned the same red banner. Access denied. Tier 1 lock in place. SkyGrid ethics hold. She walked up the aisle and leaned into the cockpit. "Captain," she whispered, "I can't override anything. Even basic manifest access is frozen." Harold didn't answer. He just stared at the screen showing the list of flagged clear sky flights. One of them blinked in red. Flight CS-147, gridlock origin. Dr. Naomi Sinclair, passenger seat 1A. He looked through the door and spotted her. Calm, still, tablet on her lap, like she was monitoring them, not flying with them. At SkyGrid's operations center in DC, 3 massive wall-to-wall screens lit up with synchronized alerts. Anna Patel, Director of Systems Integrity, stood at the center console, eyes narrowed, headset pressed to her ear. "Confirm, 152 aircraft currently flagged?" Her assistant nodded. "Including CS-147, all within FAA jurisdiction, no foreign flights affected yet." "And the trigger?" He pulled it up. "User ID, Sinclair, and authentication level. Executive Architect, Override Protocol, Gridlock, Tier 1, Ethics, Intercept." Anna raised her eyebrows. "Well," she said, "looks like Dr. Sinclair just did what the FAA never had the guts to do." Back on the plane, Naomi opened her tablet. One swipe, and her private dashboard appeared. SkyGrid live feed. Flight CS-147, each crew member now had a real-time log. Captain Harold Brent, failure to de-escalate FA Margot Steele. Unauthorized passenger flag. No ID verification, passenger white, Richard. Class-based harassment. Logged. Audio, video. She tapped the screen once. Confirm upload to FAA ethics review? Yes. Another vibration. Upload complete. Naomi didn't smile, didn't sigh. She just watched the data lock into place. Evidence, not emotion. 3 rows behind her, Richard White was unraveling. He tried refreshing his portfolio tracker again. Still no signal. He glanced at Margot as she passed. "What's happening?" Margot didn't answer. He turned to the businessman next to him. "This is unacceptable. I have a board meeting in DC and..." He lowered his voice. That woman clearly did something. The businessman didn't respond, just stared ahead. Even he knew something bigger was happening here. Ethan Collins, still filming from row 8, posted another update. "Sources confirm FAA placed ethics hold on CS-147, triggered by top-level SkyGrid authentication. Translation? This isn't just a delay. This is a system correction. # Sinclair Protocol # Flight Justice." His phone buzzed instantly, retweeted by 3 major travel blogs. A few rows ahead, a young woman showed the tweet to her seatmate. "Oh my God, that's her?" No one needed to say Naomi's name. The entire front cabin had already figured it out. Up in the tower, Calvin stared at the growing hold list. His supervisor leaned in. "Sinclair's on board?" "Yep. And not just flying, she's activated a full-scale compliance lock." The supervisor nodded slowly. "She's not just a CEO. She's the system's conscience." Inside the cockpit, Harold took a breath and finally picked up the PA. He clicked it on. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing an unexpected systems delay," he said, tone stiff. "We've been asked to remain on the ground by FAA oversight until further notice." No apology, no details, just distance. But passengers weren't buying it. One woman whispered, "This is bigger than weather." A man in business class stood, turned to Margot and asked, voice trembling just a little, "Why was that passenger flagged in the first place?" Margot didn't answer. She couldn't. Naomi finally looked up, not at Margot, at the cabin, at the passengers now turning slowly toward the front, not to accuse, but to wonder. The tide was shifting. At FAA Ethics HQ, the final report from SkyGrid came in. Evidence logged. Incidents tagged. Voices captured. Anna Patel scanned the summary, eyes focused on the digital signature at the top. Filed by Dr. Naomi Sinclair. Role: Architect. Final Authenticator. SkyGrid System. Recommendation: full FAA audit of Clear Sky Airways ethics practices. She nodded once. Open the investigation. Back on the tarmac, the air conditioning hummed softly in the paused plane. Naomi closed her tablet. Still didn't speak. But in that silence, she wasn't alone anymore. She had the system. And soon, she'd have the world watching. 34 minutes after Flight CS-147 was grounded, the name Naomi Sinclair hit the internet like a lightning strike. It started with a simple post. @Flight Watchdog tweeted, "Passenger flagged on Clear Sky Flight CS-147 may be Dr. Naomi Sinclair, the architect of SkyGrid. FAA confirmed Tier 1 ethics lock. Sinclair Protocol." No hashtags could contain what came next. Within 4 minutes, aviation blogs reposted, then tech forums, then legacy media. CNN picked it up at 8:47 past the hour. By Puzzle 52, CNBC ran a red banner. Breaking: FAA ground hold linked to SkyGrid creator Dr. Naomi Sinclair. Sources say 152 flights affected. On board the plane, the cabin transformed. Where silence once ruled, now came murmurs, gasps, and phones held to glowing faces. "She's that Naomi Sinclair? The SkyGrid woman? She created the ethics platform, and she's on this plane." In 3C, a Gen Z intern whispered to her boss, "She literally built the system that froze us." Even Richard White, now nervously tapping his wedding ring against the tray table, couldn't pretend anymore. He turned and looked at Naomi, really looked for the first time. This wasn't just a woman in 1A. This was the reason the aircraft hadn't moved. Naomi didn't acknowledge the stares. She had no need to. On her tablet, real-time analytics from the FAA interface began ticking upward. Public engagement rate, 213% above norm. Active protocols. Sinclair lock, Tier 1. FAA Legal Board. Emergency session pending. She tapped once, opening a restricted portal. Ethics Compliance Suggestion Draft. Title: SkyGrid Equity Directive, SGED. She had written it 6 months ago. No one listened. But now they were watching. At Clear Sky Airways headquarters, chaos reigned. The VP of Corporate Affairs barked into a secure Zoom line. "We need a statement, now." The legal director was pale. "If Sinclair's on board, and we flagged her, it's a direct violation of Passenger Equity Clause 4B. She owns the framework, Brian, and you authorized the staff who humiliated her." The comms director finally whispered, "The internet's calling this a system takedown. #Flight Justice is trending #1. The CEO stepped into the room, loosened his tie, and said the 2 words no one wanted to hear. "Call legal." Meanwhile, in FAA HQ, phones rang non-stop. Senator Diane Ellison, chair of the Aviation Oversight Subcommittee, was on the line. "I want a report in 2 hours," she said. and I want to speak to Dr. Sinclair personally." Anna Patel, still reviewing the ethics file Naomi had submitted, nodded slowly. "She anticipated this," she murmured. "She built the tools and the trigger." A junior analyst spoke up. "Ma'am, 3 more airlines just reported voluntary protocol reviews. They don't want to get Sinclaired." Anna turned. "Good." Back in first class, the power dynamic was crumbling. Margot had stopped pretending. She now stood 2 rows behind Naomi, looking shaken, holding her tablet like a security blanket, though it was still locked out by the SkyGrid system. She started to approach, but Naomi didn't look up, didn't grant the moment. Instead, she quietly opened her media panel. Her own statement, pre-written and time-stamped for public release, now sat ready. "I was flagged, silenced, labeled disruptive, but the system that labeled me answers to me because I built it, and now the skies are watching." She hit schedule, plus 3 minutes. Elsewhere, Ethan Collins had just hit upload on his 3rd video from row 8. This wasn't just a flight delay. This was a reckoning. She never shouted. She never fought. She activated the truth, and the truth grounded planes. Her name is Naomi Sinclair. He added a single caption, "At Telltales of Power." In Chicago, the morning news anchors were scrambling. One whispered off camera, "Who is she really?" The producer held up a phone. "MIT grad at 19, built predictive logistics for NASA at 24, founded SkyGrid at 28, sold a version to the FAA, took 0 credit, silent majority type." The anchor looked into the camera, swallowed, and began. "If you're just joining us, a dramatic ethics freeze has grounded over 150 flights. At the center, one woman. And this may be the most important silent protest in aviation history." Back on CS-147, the captain's voice came on again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been advised to remain grounded due to federal review protocols. We thank you for your patience." This time his voice trembled slightly. No applause followed, just more turning heads, more attention drawn forward. Richard White finally stood and walked slowly down the aisle toward Naomi. He paused. I didn't know who you were." She didn't flinch, didn't blink. "That was never the point," she said softly. "You treated me like I didn't belong," she added. "But I don't need you to know who I am for me to change where you land." Then she returned to her screen. Dismissed. The statement went live at exactly 58 minutes after the grounding. In less than 2 minutes, it reached 1.1 million views. FAA retweeted it. SkyGrid issued a formal policy statement. And within the hour, 5 major airlines scheduled emergency board meetings to discuss the Sinclair protocol. Naomi closed the tab. She leaned back, finally, allowing herself to exhale. She hadn't just grounded a plane. She had grounded an entire industry's excuse. And now, the sky would never be neutral again. It was a marble-paneled chamber on the 7th floor of the FAA headquarters in D.C. Senators sat in half-circle, legal counsels scribbled, and every single seat in the public gallery had been claimed within minutes. Cameras were restricted, but everyone knew the world was watching. They didn't need footage. They had her name, Naomi Sinclair, and the woman behind the name had just walked in. She didn't wear a power suit. She didn't bring a legal team. No entourage, no press handler, just a navy blue blouse, pressed slacks, and her ever-present tablet. Still no smile. Still no sound. The room stilled as she approached the witness table. The FAA chair leaned forward slightly, unsure whether to greet or apologize. Naomi simply sat. "Dr. Sinclair," the committee chair opened, "thank you for appearing before us. We understand the events of the last 24 hours have created substantial impact across federal and private air infrastructure." Naomi looked up. Her voice, when she spoke, was low, measured, razor clear. "I didn't ground 152 flights," she said. The room paused. "I logged a breach. FAA systems did the rest." There it was, the quietest mic drop DC had ever heard. Senator Diane Ellison leaned in. "You're saying the response was automatic?" "She didn't bring a legal team." Naomi nodded. Tier 1 ethics hold is built into SkyGrid's core. Once the system identifies discrimination by certified crew within a federally licensed carrier, the FAA is obligated to suspend clearance pending ethics review. So, this was standard protocol? Naomi tilted her head. It was just never triggered before. That was the moment everything in the room shifted, from suspicion to recognition. This woman hadn't staged a protest. She had enforced their own rulebook. Outside, a crowd had formed. Media vans, passengers from canceled flights, activists, former flight attendants who'd faced silent retaliation. They held up signs that read, "The skies aren't neutral. We're flying her standard now. Sinclair Protocol equals passenger power." Meanwhile, in the gallery inside, Richard White sat slumped. He had been subpoenaed to attend. He looked nothing like the smug consultant from Flight CS-147. No Bluetooth in his ear, no watch checking, just the quiet realization that his face was already part of a growing meme archive. He was no longer just a man who made a comment. He was the face of what went wrong. Naomi continued. "I submitted my findings, including audio and visual logs, under FAA Regulation 29B, subsection 8, Ethics Violation Reporting." The FAA chair glanced down. The documentation was already in their system. Naomi had uploaded everything from the plane in real time. No one had even noticed. "You acted alone?" someone asked. Naomi shook her head. "I acted within the framework." A senator near the end of the table flipped to the last page of the report. "Your proposal," she said slowly. "The SkyGrid Equity Directive. This isn't just about one flight. This is about certifying airlines by behavioral ethics scoring." Naomi didn't blink. "Yes, you want to grade them publicly. I want accountability to be more than press releases and rebranding." Gasps. A few raised eyebrows, but not one rebuttal. Because every person in that room knew the public wanted it, and they were behind on delivering it. The chair leaned forward again. "Dr. Sinclair, what do you want from this hearing?" Naomi paused, then answered calmly. "I want ethics to be measurable. I want passenger dignity to mean something, and I want every airline to know the system is watching." Later that day, the FAA announced a formal vote on adopting the Sinclair Protocol as a national framework. It passed the subcommittee in a landslide. By evening, 3 airlines announced new VP roles titled Ethics Compliance Director. Clear Sky Airways, the airline at the center of the storm, issued a full apology, suspended 5 employees, and replaced its CEO by midnight. In a follow-up interview, a CNN anchor asked Naomi, "Why didn't you respond on the plane?" Naomi just smiled faintly. "Because silence was the only sound loud enough to make the system listen." The Sinclair Protocol became more than a hashtag. It became a standard. And for the first time in decades, the skies got an upgrade not in speed or luxury, but in conscience. The week after the hearing felt like someone had flipped a switch across the entire airline industry. Except this switch wasn't about boarding groups or baggage weight. It was about accountability, about how people were treated, especially when no one thought anyone was watching. And suddenly, everyone was watching. Naomi Sinclair didn't speak at any press conferences. She didn't post reaction videos. She declined interviews. But that didn't stop people from showing up at SkyGrid's headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. Passengers, lawyers, flight crews, civil rights advocates, CEOs. Even a group of retired flight attendants from the 1970s made the trip, one of them holding a handwritten sign. "We waited 50 years for this." Inside SkyGrid, Naomi sat in a quiet conference room, reviewing a new dashboard. The live interface now tracked more than just flights. It monitored crew behavior flags, passenger complaint trends, and, most important, systemic patterns. 3 airlines had already opted into voluntary full transparency mode. 7 more were in negotiation. A small message popped up in the corner of her screen. Incoming request from FAA. Subject: Strategic Ethics Reform Partnership. Third request this week, said her operations lead, Alex. Naomi didn't look up. They'll keep asking. Alex leaned against the door. You gonna take the meeting? Naomi tapped the screen once and closed the alert. Not yet. Meanwhile, change was happening in real time. Delta Path Airlines became the first carrier to implement a mandatory Passenger Ethics Index review at check-in. Air Nova issued a 72-hour suspension to its own CEO after leaked footage showed him berating an Asian American staffer. SkyVista dropped 11% in stock price after a class action lawsuit cited Sinclair-era accountability gaps. Airline execs across the country suddenly cared about more than quarterly numbers. They cared about perception. Because perception, for the first time, came with consequences. Online, the conversation didn't slow down. A viral clip from a TikTok user showed a flight attendant gently de-escalating a tense boarding issue. The caption read, "She did it the Sinclair way. Flight justice has her SkyGrid era. Shall tell tales of dignity." The top comment? "We fly better when she's watching." One airline exec, Thomas Maddox, president of Aerostar, said during a CNBC panel, "It's not just about avoiding PR disasters anymore. It's about re-earning trust." Because Naomi Sinclair didn't bring down the system. She just held up a mirror. Back at SkyGrid, Naomi sat with a new folder in front of her. It wasn't about data. It wasn't about compliance. It was a personal letter from a single mother named Yvette Monroe. Her 8-year-old daughter had been removed from a first-class seat 3 months ago. No apology, no refund. Just quiet humiliation. The mother had filed a complaint, heard nothing. But now, she wrote, "Because of you, they called me back. They offered us 2 tickets. But I didn't want compensation. I wanted them to understand why it mattered. Thank you for making them understand." Naomi folded the letter, said nothing, but her eyes softened for the first time all day. 2 days later, a call came in from Geneva, International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO. They wanted to explore implementing SkyGrid standards globally. Naomi still didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. At Clear Sky Airlines, the company that had sparked it all, internal reshuffling had become a daily routine. Margot Steele, the former lead flight attendant on CS-147, officially resigned. Her resignation letter was brief. She admitted mishandling the situation, said she had gone through bias retraining, said she now understood that power without conscience was just noise. It wasn't redemption. But it was the first honest thing she'd written in years. The man formerly known as Richard White, quietly removed from 3 corporate boards. His firm released a public statement saying his behavior didn't align with company values. No lawsuits, no headlines, just disappearance. Naomi finally agreed to one thing, a closed-door roundtable with 5 airline CEOs, FAA ethics directors, and civil rights advocates. The meeting was strictly confidential. No press, no photos. But what came out of it, days later, was historic. The SkyGrid Conscience Pact, a binding agreement across 6 major airlines to implement. Passenger dignity metrics, real-time bias monitoring, transparent crew evaluations, independent passenger advocacy reviews. It wasn't just a PR move. It was the beginning of structural shift. When a journalist asked one of the CEOs afterward, "What made you finally agree?" he shrugged. "Because I realized, Naomi Sinclair doesn't need to sit at every table. She already designed the room." At home that night, Naomi watched the news in silence. Her name flashed across the screen again, but this time, she muted the volume. She opened her window, let the breeze in, and just sat there still. Not planning, not measuring, just breathing. Because the storm wasn't over yet. But for the first time, the winds were blowing in a better direction. 2 weeks later, The marble floors of the ICAO Global Assembly Hall in Geneva echoed with a different kind of urgency. Delegates from over 60 nations had arrived: aviation ministers, ethics regulators, commercial airline CEOs, data compliance experts. At the center of it all, a single seat marked with a discreet placard. Dr. Naomi Sinclair, SkyGrid architect Naomi, had never flown to Geneva as a guest of honor. She used to come to speak at backrooms, fringe panels, and obscure breakout sessions no one paid attention to. But this time, she was the headliner. Before she stepped on stage, she stood alone backstage, watching the feed on a private monitor. A Brazilian delegate was quoting her work on system-triggered accountability. A Kenyan aviation minister brought up how SkyGrid could close bias gaps at border security. An official from Singapore proposed regional adoption of the Sinclair Protocol as a model for intra-Asia equity metrics. Naomi's name wasn't just in the program, it was in the language now. "Ready?" asked Maya Hernandez, the ICAO chief ethics officer, standing beside her. Naomi simply nodded. No nerves, no hesitation. She had already faced worse than global scrutiny. She had faced being erased. The moderator's voice echoed as she was introduced. She did not shout. She did not retaliate. She coded accountability into the system itself. "Please welcome Dr. Naomi Sinclair." As Naomi stepped out, the room rose. Not in applause, but in respect. The kind that didn't need noise to carry weight. Her presentation wasn't flashy. No animations, no dramatic stats. Just her voice, steady and exact. Bias in aviation isn't always loud. Sometimes it's procedural. Sometimes it's algorithmic. And too often, it's unacknowledged. SkyGrid was never about revenge. It was about visibility. She then outlined the Global Flight Conscience Framework, a collaborative, ethics-integrated flight monitoring model based on anonymized behavior data, cultural context sensitivity, and real-time feedback loops for both crew and passengers. In one chart, she showed how data from 152 frozen flights had identified 4 recurring systemic gaps that were invisible before. One delegate murmured, "She mapped human dignity like airspace." After her address, the questions came fast. From France, "How do we prevent data misuse?" From South Africa, "Can this be adapted to domestic bus and rail systems?" From Japan, "Would you open source parts of SkyGrid under international compliance?" Naomi answered every question, not as a salesperson, but as an engineer with clarity and calm. And when someone finally asked, "Why now?" she replied, "Because the skies are shared, but dignity wasn't. Until now." By the next day, 19 countries signed a memorandum of interest in SkyGrid Global Access. 5 airlines in Europe committed to trialing real-time passenger bias feedback. The ICAO Ethics Task Force announced Naomi would serve as technical advisor on its next 3-year term. For a woman who used to be told to stay out of policy, the irony was palpable. Now she was writing it. But Naomi didn't celebrate. Instead, she met quietly with a small group of activists and former airline staff who'd flown in from marginalized communities around the world. A trans cabin crew member from Argentina told her, "You made invisible stories visible." An elderly black pilot from Mississippi said, "They made me fly 12 years before giving me a promotion. One freeze from you and they rewrote the rules." Naomi took no photos, just shook their hands, listened, and at the end, she said simply, "This wasn't my victory. It was overdue correction." Back in the US, media couldn't stop covering it. Forbes ran a piece titled, "The Woman Who Grounded a Plane and Rebuilt the Skies." BBC called her the quiet architect of global aviation reform. Telltales, the viral documentary YouTube channel, released a 28-minute episode chronicling the flight, the hearing, and the international fallout. Within 72 hours, it crossed 14 million views. The top comment? "This wasn't turbulence. It was justice taking off." Yet, not all reactions were smooth. Some U.S. airline lobbyists argued that SkyGrid overreached. A few anonymous execs leaked that ethics compliance would hurt profits. But in a private meeting with FAA and Department of Transportation, Naomi didn't flinch. She laid out a roadmap. SkyGrid Transparency API for public access. Mandatory ethics scoring tied to funding eligibility. Passenger Fairness Bill of Rights, anchored in the Sinclair Protocol. One advisor asked, "Won't this shake the system too much?" Naomi replied, "Only the parts that forgot who they serve." As the month closed, a new email arrived in her inbox. Subject: UN Council on Human Mobility, Global Summit, Keynote Invitation. The message was short. "You changed the skies. Now help us change how the world moves." Naomi sat back, tablet resting on her lap. For once, she allowed herself to smile. She hadn't just grounded a flight. She had launched a movement, and for the first time, the altitude felt right. It started with a single line of code. A new tag in SkyGrid system, FJI score pending, FJI, Flight Justice Index. 3 simple words that would soon redefine how airlines were evaluated. And like everything Naomi Sinclair did, it wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was precise. Naomi had returned to Arlington quietly. Geneva was behind her, but the real work, the hard, ugly, systemic work, was just beginning. She knew the industry would smile in public, shake hands for the cameras, sign a few pledges, and then, behind closed doors, stall. So she built something they couldn't stall: a live, trackable, ethics-based scoring index. Just like a credit score, but for morality. If a crew member repeatedly triggered bias complaints, it lowered the score. If an airline failed to investigate within 24 hours, down again. If a passenger from a protected demographic was removed without cause, and the incident wasn't logged properly, strike, score drop, logged forever. By week 2, SkyGrid had integrated the beta version of the FJI across 12 participating airlines. By week 4, 58% of all domestic flights in the US were under the system. And by week 6, the industry was no longer in control of the narrative. The passengers were. "I can't believe this is real," said Dana, a 62-year-old retired school teacher from Kansas City. Her story of being removed from a flight for questioning a seat reassignment had gone viral months ago. Ignored by the airline, buried by the media. Now, her case was logged into the FJI database. Her flight number triggered a system-wide protocol, and the airline's score plummeted. "I didn't want revenge," she told a local reporter. "I just wanted to matter." Within 2 months, the public could search FJI scores like Yelp ratings. Passengers began using them to pick airlines. Hashtags trended. Flyfair, #Flight Justice, #FJI Ready. Suddenly, marketing departments were calling Naomi's office, asking for guidance, partnership deals, and best practices. She didn't take the calls. Instead, she launched the second part of her plan. The Flight Ethics Training Institute, FETI. Located in a former federal building repurposed in Baltimore, FETI was the first of its kind. An accredited, federally recognized training ground for ethics-certified crew and executive leadership. The curriculum included behavioral bias response, passenger dignity in practice, AI-informed monitoring protocols, psychological de-escalation and restorative accountability. It wasn't about punishment. It was about unlearning. Naomi personally selected the first class. 42 individuals from 14 different airlines, all of whom had either submitted ethics reform proposals or had been victims of mishandled cases themselves. Their stories were the foundation of the training, not case studies, testimonies, not hypotheticals, lived pain. One man, a former Gulf War vet named Ramon, broke down on day 3. "I've been flying for 20 years and trained hundreds of new crew. Not once did we talk about dignity unless it meant smoothing over first class. Not once." A silence followed. Then Naomi, sitting in the back, said quietly, "That changes here, forever." Across the country, ripple effects exploded. A major airline was dropped from a corporate travel contract worth $110 million after its FJI dropped below 70. Another was blocked from participating in a global alliance pending an ethics audit. For years, airlines had hidden behind loyalty points and platinum lounges. Now, they were being judged by the people they tried to ignore. But not everyone loved the shift. Anonymous op-eds appeared in business journals calling SkyGrid a private surveillance state. One senator from Texas called it mob justice in digital form. Naomi never responded. She didn't need to. Because by then, passenger behavior had improved too. The FJI didn't just monitor crew, it tracked all interactions. When a passenger cursed out a Filipino flight attendant in LAX, score flagged. When a man refused to let a woman in a hijab sit beside him, documented, escalated. The system wasn't vengeful, it was equal. Everyone's accountability mattered. By the end of the third month, the White House invited Naomi for a closed-door briefing. 2 federal departments had begun integrating FJI standards into grant evaluation metrics, and an executive order was quietly drafted, requiring all government-funded air travel to meet minimum FJI compliance. For Naomi, that moment was the first real shift of institutional will, not optics, operational power. She flew home that night alone. The flight crew didn't recognize her, and that was fine. She sat quietly in seat 4A, watching out the window as the city lights dimmed below. Not once did anyone question her ticket. Not once did she have to explain herself. It was just a flight, like it should have been all along. And for the first time in years, she exhaled fully. Because justice, it turned out, didn't always need to raise its voice. Sometimes it just had to write the code and press enter. Naomi Sinclair leaned back in her chair, glancing at the conference room's muted gray walls. Her phone buzzed. Again. The final pieces of the broadcast were cued. It was the moment she had been working toward since the day she tapped that first code on flight CS-147. A moment that would echo across the skies of America, and hopefully, the world. She tapped the screen. 13 hours earlier, a rumor began circulating among airline CEOs and FAA officials. Sinclair to make public announcement at 9 p.m. Eastern. By noon, every major news outlet had a camera crew on standby. Twitter and Facebook were ablaze with speculation. Flight crews whispered in airport lounges, wondering what new rule or technology would arrive. Many worried about increased scrutiny. Some preemptively scheduled crisis management calls. Others quietly updated their ethics training modules. None could imagine the scale of what was coming. Now, the clock struck 9 p.m. Naomi's face appeared on screens worldwide. A modest studio backdrop showed the SkyGrid logo in soft blue and white, a pair of interlocking wings forming a stylized globe. She wore a navy blazer over a crisp white shirt. Her hair was neatly pulled back. No frills, no distractions, just her. The live stream chat exploded instantly. SkyGrid Equity, #Flight Justice, #Sinclair Protocol. Can't wait to see what Dr. Sinclair has up her sleeve. James, ATL. Is this what we've all been waiting for? Maria, LAX. Been on hold for 8 hours on my flight. I need this. Darnell, ORD. She took a breath and began. Good evening. Today, I share with you the next chapter in the journey we started together. A chapter that will ensure dignity, fairness, and respect are not optional in the skies, they are mandatory. Her voice was calm but resolute. I present to you SkyGrid Equity Module, a new nationwide ethics scoring and accountability system for flight crews, crew trainers, and airline executives. A soft graphic appeared behind her. The words SkyGrid Equity Module in bold, with a tagline, every flight, every crew, every passenger. For years, air travel has promised safety and comfort, but too often it failed to offer respect and equal treatment. We saw discrimination, bias, and silent injustices. We saw passengers turned away based on a boarding pass. We saw crew members ignore complaints because no one was watching. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. We said, enough. And so, as of this moment, SkyGrid will launch the equity module across all 82 federally regulated U.S. airports by year's end. The studio screen shifted to show a map of the United States with blue dots, one at each airport. Every flight crew, every attendant, every pilot, every ground staff member will now be evaluated in real time for their ethics performance, using data from passenger reports, onboard sensors, and direct crew audits. Each interaction, each decision, each response, tracked, scored, and a transparent. The chat exploded. Wow, this is a game changer. Elijah, DCA. Finally, some real accountability. Sasha, ATL. We've waited for this. Tash Telltales. Aaron, JFK. Naomi continued. We're not just assigning numbers, we're ensuring that every passenger's dignity is recognized. If a crew member mishandles a complaint, if an unverified removal occurs, if discrimination is detected, their score drops. If an airline's average crew score dips below 70, they face automatic FAA audits and mandatory retraining. If it dips below 60, they risk temporary ground holds, similar to what Clear Sky experienced. A graphic illustrated, score 70, audit, score badge 60, temporary ground hold. To the passengers watching, you now have a voice you didn't have before. Every in-flight app will allow you to report service issues, quietly, respectfully, in real time. That data will feed directly into SkyGrid's algorithms and be reviewed by an independent ethics oversight council composed of veteran flight attendants, civil rights advocates, and passenger representatives. She clicked a remote. The screen shifted to a short video clip. A family boarding, a toddler in a hijab, an elderly man with a cane, a young black woman in a business suit. The camera panned to a flight attendant helping the toddler with seat belts, then to the same toddler's mother receiving a warm smile rather than a suspicious glance. Then to a pilot making eye contact and acknowledging the elderly man. This is what equity looks like, Naomi's voice played over the footage. Small moments, big impact, and we've coded these principles into SkyGrid's AI. Every time a cabin crew member shows empathy, sensitivity, and respect, their scores go up. Every time they zone out, ignore a passenger, or treat someone as less than, their scores go down. The clip ended. Naomi's face returned. Yes, she said. We measured empathy, courtesy, and procedural fairness, and we tied them to real consequences. A hush fell. The world was listening. Backstage, Alex watched the chat surge. It was surreal. We're trending worldwide, he whispered. Even in China and India, they're talking about it. Naomi nodded, no expression. It's live right now? He asked. It is, she said. Tell the ops teams to continue rollout. No errors. Every data stream, every camera, every feedback channel. Live by midnight. He swallowed. Yes, Dr. Sinclair. Across the country, passenger reaction was instant. International travelers expected a global version. Corporate clients began drafting statements. We require FJI-certified airlines for all employee travel. Media analysts debated the cost. Could airlines maintain profitability with ethics compliance officers at every gate? The next morning, the FAA's official site ran a short bulletin. Effective immediately, all U.S. airports regulated under FAA Part 121 are mandated to implement the SkyGrid Equity Module by December 31, 2025. Airlines are required to submit weekly ethics score reports. Failure to comply will result in suspension of operating certificates. No press release, no elaborate fanfare, just the facts. By noon, the stock market had responded. Clear Sky Airways stock dropped 8% as analysts recalculated operational risk. Delta Path Airlines stock rose 5% on news they had volunteered early. Orion Ethics Capital announced a $500 million fund to support small carriers in meeting compliance, sending their stock up 12%. It was a data-driven proof of concept. Ethics had become equity. Meanwhile, at FITI in Baltimore, the first cohort of ethics trainees logged into a live simulation. "Okay, team," their instructor, Captain Elena Rivers, said. "Your flight scenario: a business traveler in 1C overhears a passenger in 2A express fear that their child, wearing a hijab, is a security risk. The business traveler demands the child be removed. The attendant in 3F tries to calm both sides. How do you respond?" The trainees typed responses, empathy statements, reassurance tactics, de-escalation scripts. Captain Rivers watched the simulation dashboard. Every keystroke, every grammatical choice was scored. "Remember," she said, "this isn't about being perfect. It's about demonstrating intentional respect." A trainee, Marcus, a former USAF pilot turned commercial captain, hesitated. "In the old days," he said quietly, "we'd just move them, but we wouldn't address the prejudice. Now, we have to call it out. That's new." "That's exactly why you're here," Captain Rivers replied. "You're changing the culture." In a small office at NASA's research arm in Houston, Dr. Josephine Tran, an aeronautical engineer and longtime friend of Naomi's, shook her head as she read the SkyGrid codebase. "You've done it," she said softly. "You've shown that technology can enforce ethics." Naomi nodded via video call. "It's not perfect. It's a start, but it's far beyond what any of us thought possible 5 years ago." "The world is watching," Dr. Tran continued. "This could become the global standard, if it's adopted." Naomi closed her eyes, letting that sink in. "Then we'll need partners," she said. By mid-afternoon, an unusual email pinged in Naomi's inbox. From White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, subject, Executive Review of Federal Travel Guidelines. "Dr. Sinclair, the President has requested your input in drafting the new Federal Travel Ethics Directive. Your presence at the Oval Office is requested next Tuesday at 10 a.m. She stared at the message. "So," Alex said, peering over her shoulder, "that's how we know it's working." Naomi nodded. "Prepare the brief. We'll discuss metrics, privacy safeguards, and real-time audit protocols." "Understood." But inside, Naomi felt a familiar tension. The higher she climbed, the more she realized how many people, powerful people, had built careers on not seeing. Now, they had to see. That evening, Clear Sky announced a multi-million-dollar investment in upgrading their in-flight systems to integrate SkyGrid sensors and passenger reporting tools. They issued a public apology to Naomi and all passengers who had been harmed by their previous policies. They pledged to meet or exceed FJI standards within 6 months. Some hailed it as progress. Others wondered if it was too little, too late. But the real test came when a small regional carrier in the Midwest, Heartland Air, announced their first quarterly ethics report. FJI score, 72.4, above national average. Diversity training completion rate, 98% passenger satisfaction, 94% bias. Incident reports, 1, resolved within 24 hours. Their CEO, a former Marine named Lisa Carter, posted a video. "We joined SkyGrid early because we want to do right by our passengers. It's not easy, but it's worth it. Because when you fly into someone's life, you have a responsibility, whether you're the pilot, the attendant, or the person handing out peanuts." Within hours, Heartland's bookings rose 15%. Their stock, traded on a regional exchange, climbed 20%. It was concrete proof that passenger loyalty had shifted. They wanted ethics. Back at SkyGrid HQ, Naomi watched the Heartland announcement on mute. She felt a quiet satisfaction, even as she anticipated new challenges. How to protect passenger privacy while collecting essential data. How to ensure smaller carriers with fewer resources could comply. how to guard against corporate manipulation of the system. She turned to Alex. "We need a scholarship program for underserved airlines," she said. Alex nodded vigorously. "I've drafted a proposal, the Sky Grid Equity Fund. $50 million to subsidize hardware, training, and compliance audits for regional and minority-owned carriers." Naomi exhaled. "Let's finalize it." As the sun set over the Potomac, Naomi walked through a small park adjacent to the Arlington campus. She paused to admire the reflection of the city on the water. It was peaceful. For a moment, she closed her eyes and let herself feel what she had accomplished and what still lay ahead. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a worn boarding pass from years ago, her original CEO ticket. She had kept it as a reminder, a symbol of what had started it all. She let it flutter free, the wind catching it and carrying it away, because she had moved on. Now, she was in a new place, where equity soared, and the world, finally, was paying attention to the right things. The morning light in Washington, D.C., felt unusually sharp as Naomi Sinclair stepped out of the metro station near the FAA headquarters. The air was crisp, but the weight of what awaited her inside felt colder than any draft. She walked up the marble steps, nodding once to the security guard, who gave her a respectful nod in return. No questions asked. After all, Dr. Sinclair was now as much a fixture in federal oversight as any high-ranking official. Inside the FAA building, conference rooms brimmed with activity. Reporters jostled for camera angles in hallways. Staffers scurried around carrying stacks of binders labeled Sky Grid Equity, Data Logs, EEOC Case Files, and FAA Ethics Review Package. It was the first day the FAA and the EEOC were collaborating on a full-scale industry investigation. Naomi paused at the reception desk to check in for her meeting with the FAA Commissioner and the EEOC's Deputy Director. Once cleared, she proceeded down a long corridor, passing framed photographs of early aviation pioneers. It seemed ironic. These men and women had broken barriers to let people fly. Now her work would break barriers to make flying fair. Inside a large oval conference room, Naomi found a dozen aviation executives already seated. Their faces showed a mixture of exhaustion, apprehension, and some genuine regret. At the head of the table sat FAA Commissioner Elena Rivera and EEOC Deputy Director Marcus Whitfield. Between them, stacks of printouts and digital tablets glowed in anticipation. Naomi took the vacant seat beside Alex, her longtime operations lead. He gave her a quick thumbs up, though they both understood the stakes had never been higher. Commissioner Rivera stood and addressed the group. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. As of this morning, the FAA, in collaboration with the EEOC, is launching a sector-wide ethics and discrimination audit. We're here to ensure every airline operating under FAA Part 121 adheres to the new Sinclair Protocol and Flight Justice Index standards. This isn't optional. This is mandatory." Her gaze swept the room. "We have identified patterns of systemic bias in crew training modules, passenger handling protocols, and complaint escalation processes. We have 5 months to complete the first phase of our investigation, examining all records of reported incidents from January 2024 to present. EEOC will coordinate the Civil Rights Compliance Review. The FAA will handle operational and safety standards." Deputy Director Whitfield nodded. "Any airline found in violation of Title VII or Section 1981 will face civil penalties. Additionally, crew members who engaged in discriminatory conduct will be referred to local EEOC offices for potential action. This is not a smear campaign. This is a fact-finding mission. But make no mistake, we will enforce consequences." A hush fell. Some executives exchanged nervous glances. Outside the room, reporters lined up, ready to pounce. The first newswire flashed. FAA, EEOC. Announced joint probe into airline industry bias. Sinclair Protocol at center. By lunchtime, social media was flooded. Aviation's new era of accountability. Passengers finally heard. #Flight Justice. Who's next on the chopping block? That afternoon, Naomi retreated to her office at SkyGrid HQ. She sipped a cup of coffee while scanning the initial inquiries from the FAA's data team. Complete Passenger Complaint Archives, 2024 to I-25. Crew training manuals from top 20 carriers. All discipline action reports for unverified removals or disruptive flags. Transcripts and video logs from flight incidents flagged under FJI. Her phone buzzed. It was a forwarded email from Senator Diane Ellison's office. Sinclair, thank you for your unparalleled work. Let me know if you need further legislative support. Naomi allowed herself a subtle smile. She typed a brief reply. Thank you, Senator. We will be in touch. That evening, at a small gathering in Baltimore, 25 FETI graduates convened for their first alumni meet and greet. They shared stories of their recent flights, how much had changed in just a few months. One young flight attendant, Tyra from Atlanta, described handing an iPad to a nervous passenger of Middle Eastern descent, walking her through the in-flight reporting app, and seeing tears of relief when the passenger realized her voice was heard. Tyra's FJI score was now 92, a testament to the empathy training she'd received. Another, Diego from Phoenix, recounted how his airline had revamped the way crew assignments were made, rotating seats to eliminate old guard cliques that once policed passenger behavior. His FJI score rose 15 points that month. Naomi listened quietly as they toasted with sparkling cider. She felt a deep satisfaction, but also the pull of unfinished business. The industry was beginning to shift, but certain carriers and entrenched managers would still resist. 2 mornings later, at 9:00 a.m., Naomi met with a coalition of passengers who'd filed formal complaints last year, individuals whose experiences had catalyzed the first FJI proposals. Among them was Dana, the retired school teacher, now traveling to Atlanta with a confident smile. Ramon, the veteran-turned-flight attendant, and a young lawyer named Priya Patel, who had lost her promotion because an executive insisted she was too emotional to be a team lead. They gathered in a modest conference room wired for video. A camera streamed the meeting live to an online forum for aviation justice activists, where thousands tuned in. Dana began, her voice steady. Dr. Sinclair, before SkyGrid, I felt invisible. Today, I'm overjoyed knowing another family will never face what I did. But we can't stop here. My granddaughter, she's 10, and she's already writing essays about fair skies. We need to think ahead, for her generation. Ramon nodded. I've flown with 3 airlines in the past 6 months. One just implemented suggested de-escalation scripts. Another is refining their lavender language training so all crew understand how to address LGBTQ+ passengers respectfully. But some smaller carriers still don't have funds to integrate the tech. They're sidelined. Priya leaned forward. That's why we need legal backing. We need state attorneys general to push for FJI integration at the local level, especially where public funding is involved. Otherwise, it becomes a patchwork, and vulnerable passengers fall through the cracks. Naomi took a deep breath. You're right. Regional and municipal advocacy will be critical. I've drafted a proposal for the SkyGrid Equity Fund, an initial $50 million endowment to subsidize tech integration and training for small and minority-owned carriers. It's slated to launch next quarter, and we'll work with NGOs and state regulators to ensure equitable distribution. They all exchanged glances, relief washing over their faces. But Dana spoke up again, softer. We also need oversight. Once carriers get funded, how do we ensure they continue? Could there be community boards to review ongoing FJI scores and hold them accountable? Naomi nodded. That's why we're forming local passenger advocacy councils. They'll receive anonymized quarterly FJI reports, so communities can see how carriers perform. Councils will be comprised of passengers, former crew, and local civil rights leaders. Their recommendations will be sent to the FAA regional offices. Ramon frowned. Sounds ideal, but how do we prevent political hijacking? Local boards can get messy, special interests, lobbyists. Naomi didn't flinch. The initial guidelines will ensure that councils remain independent. will require transparency, open meetings, published minutes, and appeals processes. Any attempt to co-opt a council will trigger a review of that region's FJI data flow. Priya tapped on her tablet. I'll help draft those bylaws. We'll base them on successful community oversight models, like those used in public transit boards. Later that afternoon, Naomi joined a Zoom call with 2 senators, a pair of House representatives, and staffers from the Department of Transportation. They'd assembled to review a draft of the Passenger Fairness Bill of Rights, legislation intended to codify the FJI and related protections into federal law. Senator Ellison began. Dr. Sinclair, this bill represents the culmination of months of testimony and data analysis. It will ensure that any airline receiving federal funds or operating under FAA Part 121 must comply. Violations carry civil and criminal penalties. Do you have any final adjustments? Naomi scanned the document. Section 13 referenced passenger dignity protections. Section 19 covered FJI compliance audits. And Section 27 outlined civil rights violations and EEOC referrals. It was robust. She paused at Section 34A, which described an independent aviation justice office within the DOJ to oversee compliance. I'd recommend adding language for periodic sunset reviews. Every 5 years, a bipartisan committee must reassess. Technology evolves. So must our safeguards. A representative jotted notes. Agreed, she added. Also, let's clarify that all FJI data must be stored in a tamper-proof ledger with blockchain authentication. That will prevent retroactive changes and ensure transparency. The staffers nodded. Excellent point. By 5:00 p.m., legislators were preparing to introduce the Passenger Fairness Bill of Rights as a joint resolution. News outlets had already acquired leaks. Headlines blared, "Nationwide law will force airlines to protect passenger dignity." Sinclair-backed bill drives paradigm shift in air travel. That evening, at SkyGrid HQ, Naomi gathered the core team, Alex, Dr. Josephine Tran, and their lead data scientists, to celebrate quietly. Glasses of sparkling water clinked. "It's been a whirlwind," Alex said. "From that flight in Dallas to now, we've come so far." Naomi offered a rare smile. "We're just getting started. There are still carriers who haven't signed on. We still have to tackle data privacy concerns about how FJI scores are shared. We have to ensure this works for cargo pilots, business jets, and eventually, the international market." Dr. Tran chimed in. "Actually, MIT's research team is already running pilots on in-flight AI that can detect bias in spoken language. It's like emotion recognition but tailored for cabin etiquette. If it passes ethical review, we can integrate it next year." A hush fell. This was next-level stuff. Naomi raised her glass. To innovation, integrity, and the unsung heroes who refused to stay silent. They drank. On Saturday, the EEOC published its initial report. Preliminary findings: systemic bias risks in U.S. commercial airlines. It detailed how, over the past decade, complaints about discrimination based on race, gender, religion, and disability had increased 270%, but fewer than 15% had resulted in any formal resolution. The report praised SkyGrid's work. The Flight Justice Index represents the most comprehensive data-driven approach to addressing aviation bias we have seen. Netizens celebrated. Sinclair Winds trended. Passengers shared personal stories of previously ignored incidents. Cheap flights where they were forced to check assistive devices. Elderly travelers denied special meal accommodations. Pregnant women left stranded without seatbelt extenders. One story, reposted widely, told of a veteran in a wheelchair who had been stranded on a jet bridge for 2 hours because the crew refused to lower the lift. The FJI flagged that airline within days. Their score dropped from 85 to 62. After review, the airline issued a public apology, retrained staff, and committed to a new policy: lift first, talk second. That Sunday afternoon, Naomi decided to visit a small family bakery in Annandale, Virginia, her childhood friend Maya's place. The smells of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls felt comforting, grounding. She sat at a corner table while Maya brought her a latte and a plate of scones. They hadn't seen each other in weeks. Maya surveyed Naomi's weary face and reached across to squeeze her hand. "Hey," Maya said, "you look tired. Are they really doing all of this?" Naomi took a deep breath. "They are. But sometimes, when you're changing a culture, it takes a village, and we've barely tapped into that village." Maya nodded. "I saw on Telltales. Your documentary hit 20 million views. Even my parents watched it. They're proud of you." Naomi smiled. "Thank you. But you know, this isn't about me. It's about every passenger who was told they didn't matter." Maya slid a small box across. "I baked these last night. Cinnamon pecan rolls. Your favorite. Fuel for the revolution?" Naomi chuckled. "Never underestimate the power of sugar." They laughed. For a moment, life felt normal. Monday morning brought more news. United Airlines announced they would fast-track integration with SkyGrid, offering free ethics training to 3,000 crew members in Q1 2026. Southwest declared a zero-tolerance policy for unverified removals. Any complaint that flagged a potential FJI violation would trigger immediate investigation. Jetstream Cargo, an all-cargo operator, sent a notice that they were piloting a version of FJI for freight crews to ensure non-discriminatory loading protocols and fair treatment of charter clients. Across the board, it felt as if aviation was being re-engineered in real time. Yet Naomi remained focused on the next challenge, international alignment. She had calls scheduled later that day, with Airbus executives in Toulouse and Boeing's ethics chief in Seattle, to begin defining a joint Global Flight Justice Consortium. The goal was to ensure that no matter where a passenger boarded, they could expect the same level of dignity, safety, and transparency. That evening, as Naomi boarded a red-eye to Seattle, she sat in seat 2A. The flight attendant greeted her by name, having recognized her from the FETI leadership roster. "I just wanted to say thank you, Dr. Sinclair," she said softly. "I'm one of the first graduates of FETI's management track. I never thought I'd see the day when I'd be proud to say, yes, I helped make flying better." Naomi nodded. "Keep up the good work, and reach out if you see anything that needs improvement." "They already have a direct reporting line to SkyGrid monitoring," the attendant replied, a hint of pride in her voice. Naomi settled back. She looked out the window at the runway lights blinking in the dark. She felt a familiar hush, the moment before engines roar to life. She allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. In just under a year, the seed she planted on a grounded flight had blossomed into a movement. From FAA hearings to Geneva summits, from FETI workshops to late-night code sprints, the journey had been relentless. But there was still so much to do, because equity was not a finite milestone. It was an ongoing horizon. As the jet began its takeoff roll, Naomi closed her eyes. The engine surged, lifting the aircraft into the night sky, a quiet reminder that with momentum, even the heaviest systems can rise. And somewhere, above her, the Starlink satellites streamed data, feeding the SkyGrid network, watching, listening, ensuring that justice took flight every single time. The final day of her reunion tour began before dawn. Naomi Sinclair touched down at Dulles International Airport in Virginia, stepping off the jet with the quiet composure that had become her signature. She wore a simple black trench coat, her hair pinned neatly at the back. No flash, no pretense, just the sleek confidence of someone who knew the world was watching. As she descended the gangway, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. Rows of passengers, some who had flown multiple times under new SkyGrid protocols, lined the walkway, banners in hand that read, "Justice among the clouds. Sinclair Protocol equals human dignity. We fly because we matter." Children who had once clutched their parents' hands before boarding a flight now stood tall and curious. A middle-aged woman in a patterned headscarf wiped away tears, remembering how her pleas were once ignored. Even the airline staff, pilots, attendants, mechanics, gathered at respectful distances, wondering how this would end. Naomi paused at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at the cabin behind her. Passengers peering through windows, cabin crew standing in uniform. She didn't speak. She didn't wave. She simply took a deep breath, let that moment sink in. "I didn't realize how much this means until I saw all of you here," she said softly, projecting to those around without a microphone. "Thank you for being part of this." A ripple of applause started, then another. Soon, it swelled into a standing ovation, measured, respectful, full of gratitude. None of it theatrical, none of it over the top. Just the quiet honor due to someone who had redefined an entire industry. 2 hours later, in a small auditorium at the nearby convention center, Naomi joined a panel of passenger advocates and airline executives. A single camera recorded for a series titled Flight Paths to Fairness. A moderator began, "Dr. Sinclair, it's been 6 months since SkyGrid Equity went live nationwide, and 3 since we saw the first international pilots adopting the Flight Justice Index. What's changed?" She leaned forward, hands folded on her lap. "We've seen a 40% decrease in formal discrimination complaints across all major U.S. carriers. We've also seen a 12% increase in passengers who identify as disabled, elderly, or from minority backgrounds traveling on commercial flights. That tells me 2 things. 1, people trust the system, and 2, they trust each other again." An airline CEO on the panel, a woman named Gina Torres, nodded. "Our 5 largest carriers all reported improved brand loyalty scores. We've never seen feedback this positive. People feel heard." A passenger advocate added, "I still get emails from people telling me they flew again after years of avoiding planes, not because of cheaper fares, but because they felt safe." Naomi's gaze softened. That's the real victory. Later that evening, she flew to Miami for a private dinner with the founding members of the International Flight Justice Consortium. Over plates of fresh ceviche and empanadas, they reviewed progress updates. Canada had just adopted a pilot version of FJI for its domestic flights. Brazil integrated bias detection tools in 5 major airports. Germany announced SkyGrid-compatible monitors in its regional jets. Australia pledged research funding to develop accent-sensitive voice analysis modules to ensure no passenger is penalized for speaking with an accent. Each delegate shared personal stories. An Indian representative explained how rural women in Hyderabad, once afraid to fly alone, were now booking seats because they felt assured they'd be treated fairly. A South Korean airline exec described how silent discrimination, legitimate complaints being ignored, had plummeted to near zero. Naomi listened from one side of the table, her expression neutral. But inside, her heart swelled. These weren't just data points. They were human lives reshaped. The next morning, in a small church auditorium in rural Georgia, Naomi joined a town hall gathering for local residents. The room was packed, some standing, because people had traveled miles to attend. A teenage girl stood at the microphone. She wore a Girl Scout sash and held a piece of paper nervously. "Dr. Sinclair, I wrote a report for my civics class about you and the SkyGrid. My mom used to be scared of flying because pilots told her she might interfere with their shift. Now she flies to see her grandchildren without fear." Naomi crouched to meet her eye level. "You should be proud. Sharing stories changes minds. That's how we build a better system." She ruffled the girl's hair, and the audience, mostly seniors, clapped. A local pastor, Father Miguel Reyes, then said, "We've seen a minister's wife recently travel back home for her mother's funeral without a single staff member questioning her wheelchair. That's because someone cared enough to share her story with SkyGrid. We say grace for that logic." The congregation laughed, then applauded again. Naomi felt a gentle warmth spread across her chest, an affirmation that real lives were touched, not just policies. On her flight back to DC, Naomi settled into 4C. She glanced around. The toddler in the hijab, now giggling as her father played peekaboo from the aisle. The elderly man with a cane offering his seat to a pregnant woman. The couple in 8A toasting with sparkling juice. Their flight uneventful, even mundane. She pulled out her tablet and checked live FJI metrics. Average crew empathy score, 92.3. National ethics compliance rate, 96%. Passenger satisfaction index, 4.85. She let out a quiet sigh. Good numbers, but she knew the work wasn't finished. That evening, as twilight painted the Capitol's reflecting pool in shades of pink, Naomi walked along Constitution Avenue. She paused before a small monument to early aviators, Orville and Wilbur Wright, Amelia Earhart, people who had once dreamed of humans conquering the skies. They took flight for freedom. Naomi's generation was taking flight for dignity. Her phone buzzed. It was an alert from SkyGrid. New report. First-grade pilot at Eclipse jet failed to follow protocol. Disrupted passenger without verification. That score would drop within hours. An internal email would go out to Eclipse. Review in 24 hours or face ground hold. She whipped the phone off, slipping it into her pocket. No indulgence in smug satisfaction. Her work required constant vigilance. Instead, she lifted her gaze to the horizon, senses attuned to the hum of passing cars, the chatter of tourists, the rush of life. 2 nights later, a small contingent of Flight Justice Index developers gathered at SkyGrid HQ for a celebratory dinner. Pizza, salad, and cookies. Simple fare. They toasted one another with sparkling cider. Alex raised his glass. To Dr. Sinclair, you believed we could code compassion. They clinked glasses. Naomi smiled genuinely. To all of you, you turned an idea into an ecosystem. You made flying a little more human. A junior data engineer, who'd been part of the initial FJI beta, grinned. Remember when we thought 50% coverage was impossible? Now it's 96%. Laughter. A few relieved exhalations. They knew they were writing history in real time. The following morning, Naomi visited her old high school in Bethesda, Maryland, Oak Crest Academy. She was invited to speak to the junior class about leadership, ethics, and technology. The auditorium brimmed with 15-year-olds, some doodling on notebooks, others glued to phones. She took the stage. 20 years ago, I sat where you are. I was the kid who liked coding more than pep rallies. I cared about fairness, whether in classroom elections or in computer games. I never imagined that one day I'd be changing how people experience flight. But it all started with a belief that no one should be told they don't belong just because of who they are or what they look like. A hand shot up. Did you ever get scared? Like, what if no one cared? She paused. Of course, many times. But I learned that courage doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right despite fear. And sometimes people will care. Maybe even thousands of people you've never met. They scribbled notes, some faces lighting up with the first flicker of possibility. Later that afternoon, Naomi walked through her childhood neighborhood. She passed the corner store where she used to buy candy, the community center where her dad taught Sunday school, the park where she chased after her little brother. She paused by the wrought iron gate of her family's former home, now a modest but respectable rental duplex. She remembered sitting at that kitchen table, pleading with her parents to let her build a computer from spare parts. They'd encouraged her. They'd told her, if you can dream it, you can code it. She smiled, thinking how far those words had carried her. At dusk, back at SkyGrid HQ, Naomi finally closed her laptop, leaned back in her chair, and exhaled with a rare sigh of contentment. She thought of the toddler with the hijab, the elderly man with the cane, and the young pilot whose drone had first captured that video on Flight CS-147's cabin. The world had changed since that fateful day. But she also thought of the pilots still learning to empathize, the passengers still waiting for their stories to matter, the international partners still crafting local versions of the FJI. Her work was never truly done. She stood, zipped up her leather jacket, and walked out into the night. The city lights sparkled behind her like a constellation of opportunity and promise. Above, a plane roared past, heading west. For a moment, Naomi held her breath, listening to that engine hum. Then she smiled, because for once, the sky didn't feel limitless in ambition alone. It felt limitless in fairness, in dignity, in the simple knowledge that from now on, no one would be erased without consequence. She walked on, knowing that as long as people still flew, her mission endured.